In the spring of 1897, a farmer named John McDougall was doing what farmers in rural Ontario had always done at that time of year. He was clearing land, moving rocks, cutting roots, leveling the earth to make room for another season of crops. He was working near the base of a low hill on his property just outside the town of Petrolia, a stretch of land that most people in the county had walked over 100 times without thinking twice about it. It was ordinary ground, ordinary enough that nobody had ever bothered to dig beneath it in any serious way. Nobody thought there was anything under there worth finding. McDougall was not a man who went looking for mysteries. He was practical, hard-working, the kind of man who measured the value of a day by what he produced. But when his shovel broke through a layer of packed earth and dropped into empty space, he stopped. He knelt down. He peered into the dark, and what he found in the hours that followed would send shockwaves through the small academic world of Canadian archaeology, draw the attention of newspapers across the country, and spark a debate that has never fully been resolved to this day. What he found was a room, a real, constructed, enclosed room, buried beneath the surface of that hill. It had walls. It had what appeared to be a floor. It had dimensions that suggested deliberate planning, not some natural geological formation or a collapsed cave. Somebody had built this. Somebody had put it here, underground, and then it had sat in darkness for a very long time. How long? That was the question that shook everything. Because when the people who examined it began to calculate its age, they kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. This structure predated Canada. It predated European settlement. It predated the oldest colonial records in the region by centuries, possibly by much more than that. Whatever was buried in that hill on John McDougall's farm had been built by someone who lived in this land long before anyone from the Old World ever set foot on North American soil. And that raised the real question. By who? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Canada has an origin story most of its citizens know by heart. The French came, then the British, then wars and treaties and confederation in 1867. That is the official beginning. But underneath that story, buried in the literal soil of the land, there is a much older and much stranger history that Canadian textbooks rarely touch, a history that does not begin with European ships, a history that belongs to people who were here first, and possibly to people whose presence we still cannot fully explain. The discovery on McDougall's farm was not a single event with a clean resolution. It was the beginning of a slow, complicated investigation that pulled in amateur diggers, professional archaeologists, newspaper editors, First Nations oral historians, and a loose community of researchers who became convinced that what had been found in Ontario was not unique, that it was part of something larger, a pattern of underground structures, earthworks, and buried chambers across pre-colonial North America that nobody in power particularly wanted to discuss. We are going to go deep into it, not just the chamber itself, but everything surrounding it, the context of who was living in Ontario before Europeans arrived. The traditions of underground architecture that existed on this continent long before colonial contact, the parallels between what was found in that hill and what other excavators were turning up in Ohio, in Minnesota, in the forests of Quebec, and the question that hovers over all of it: what were these people building and why? Let's start at the beginning. Not with McDougall, but with the land itself. Ontario in the late 19th century looked nothing like what it looks like today. The industrial cities and highways and suburbs that define it now did not exist. But even what the settlers saw when they arrived in the 1700s and 1800s was itself a transformed landscape. The great hardwood forests they encountered, the rivers running clean and cold, the wetlands full of fish and birds, all of that was not a virgin wilderness. It was the result of thousands of years of human management. Burning, planting, harvesting, traveling, trading. The people who had managed this landscape for millennia were the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and others whose nations had complex political systems, trade networks that stretched across the continent, and a deep and detailed understanding of the land they inhabited. They had names for every hill, every river bend, every patch of soil with particular qualities. The land was not empty to them. It was full of meaning, full of history, full of stories. And some of those stories were about what lay under the ground. There is a long tradition among many indigenous nations of North America of structures built beneath the surface, not just storage pits or graves, but actual living and ceremonial spaces, earth lodges, semi-subterranean houses, underground council chambers, passages leading from one space to another below the frost line where temperature stayed constant. These were not primitive arrangements. They were engineering solutions developed over centuries of living in climates that swung between brutal heat and killing cold. When MacDougall broke through into that underground room in 1897, he may not have known he was looking at something built by people whose descendants were still living nearby. Or he may have suspected it and said nothing. The politics of that moment in Canadian history were not friendly to the idea of Indigenous sophistication. The residential school system was in full operation. The government was actively working to erase Indigenous cultures from the national memory. Finding an ancient underground room and announcing that it was evidence of complex pre-colonial engineering would have complicated that story considerably. So the story got complicated anyway, just more slowly than it should have. The first account of the discovery appeared in the Petrolia Advertiser in late May of 1897. The language was careful. It described MacDougall's find as an unusual subterranean enclosure of apparent antiquity. It gave dimensions. Roughly 12 feet across in its widest section, with walls of fitted stone on at least two sides, a third side that appeared to be natural bedrock shaped and smoothed by human hands. The ceiling had collapsed in one section, which was presumably why MacDougall's shovel had broken through, but the main chamber was still largely intact. The article noted that several objects had been found inside. Fragments of pottery, what appeared to be fire-hardened clay, a piece of carved bone that was described as resembling a tool of some kind, and in one corner, a deposit of ash and charcoal that suggested the space had been used for fire at some point in the distant past. The reporter who wrote the piece was clearly excited. He used phrases like remarkable discovery and evidence of a civilized people, and wondered in print whether this might shed new light on the true age of human occupation in Ontario. He was pushing toward a question that polite Canadian society was not quite ready to ask directly. Were people living here, building here, making here, thousands of years before anyone in the colonial world had any idea? The answer, of course, was yes. It had always been yes. But the depth of that yes, the full complexity and sophistication of it, was something that mainstream archaeology was still decades away from acknowledging in full. In 1897, the dominant narrative went something like this. Indigenous people in North America had been here for maybe 10,000 years. They had lived in a state of relative simplicity, without writing, without permanent structures, without the kind of organized civilization that Europe could point to and say, yes, this is what advanced humanity looks like. They were part of nature, rather than shapers of it. And the Europeans who came and displaced them were not destroyers of something great. They were builders of something new on land that had been, in the colonial imagination, mostly empty. The MacDougall chamber was a problem for that narrative. Not an insurmountable one, not yet. But a problem nonetheless. Because the construction was not primitive. It was not a collapsed animal den or a natural hollow that someone had used for brief shelter. It was deliberate, it was architectural, it demonstrated planning, skill, and a tradition of building that had to have been developed over a very long time. Somebody knew how to do this. Somebody taught somebody else how to do this. And that teaching happened here, on this land, over generations, long before any European hand ever touched this soil. The question that the Petrolia reporter was circling around, the one he couldn't quite bring himself to ask directly, was this. If this room was here, what else was here? What else had been built, used, abandoned, and buried in the hills and valleys of pre-colonial Ontario? And what had happened to the people who built it? Those questions opened a door. and once it was open, it turned out to be very difficult to close. In the weeks after the Petrolia Advertiser published its initial report, something happened that surprised almost everyone involved. People started showing up at McDougall's farm. Not just local curiosity seekers, though there were plenty of those, but people with notebooks, people who said they were interested in old things. A schoolteacher from Sarnia, who had been collecting arrowheads for 15 years, a retired minister from London who had read widely in what was then called natural history, a young man from Toronto who said he was corresponding with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and wanted to document everything he could before the site was disturbed further. Their accounts, collected and compared, began to fill in details that the newspaper article had only sketched. The chamber was deeper than it first appeared. Once the entrance was properly cleared, it was possible to stand fully upright inside part of it. The fitted stone walls were not random. They followed a deliberate pattern, with larger stones forming a base course and smaller, more carefully selected stones above. In one section, the stones appeared to have been shaped, not just chosen. There was evidence of tool marks on several of them, marks that could only have been made by a hard instrument striking repeatedly at a particular angle. This was not accidental construction. This was masonry. The schoolteacher from Sarnia, whose name was recorded in one account as William Hartley, kept the most detailed notes of any of the early visitors. His journal, portions of which were later reproduced in a regional historical publication in the 1920s, described the chamber with care that was unusual for an amateur. He noted the dimensions at multiple points, sketched the arrangement of the stone courses, and carefully documented the artifacts he found or was shown. The carved bone piece had been removed by McDougall and placed in the farmhouse for safekeeping. Hartley examined it there. He described it as approximately 8 inches long, smoothed along its outer surface in a way that suggested prolonged handling, with a series of parallel incised lines along one face that did not appear to be decorative, but rather functional in some way. He compared it to pieces he had seen in a collection at the University of Toronto, specimens from sites in Ohio and Minnesota that were attributed to what archaeologists of that era called the Mound Builders. The Mound Builders. In 1897, the Mound Builders were not a settled category of history. They were a mystery, a controversy, and deeply relevant to what had just been found in the hill on McDougall's farm. The landscape of eastern North America was full of mounds, thousands of them. Low earthen hills rising from the flatlands of Ohio and Indiana, geometric earthworks along the rivers of the Midwest, conical burial mounds scattered across the forests of Ontario and Quebec, effigy mounds shaped like animals and serpents stretching for hundreds of feet across hilltops in Wisconsin. In the 19th century, the settler world refused to believe that indigenous North Americans had built these things. The cognitive dissonance was too great. So they invented the Mound Builders, a separate, vanished race, possibly descended from ancient Israelites or Egyptians who had come to North America in some remote age, built their mounds, and been wiped out by the ancestors of the people the settlers were currently fighting. It justified the conquest, and it was completely wrong. Modern archaeology has established beyond any reasonable doubt that the mounds and earthworks of North America were built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who were still living there when Europeans arrived. The Hopewell culture built the great geometric earthworks of Ohio and Indiana. Cahokia was built by the ancestors of the Osage and Quapaw. The burial mounds of Ontario and Quebec were constructed by the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee and Algonquian-speaking peoples. But in 1897, the mound builder myth was very much in circulation. And when William Hartley compared the carved bone from McDougall's chamber to artifacts from Ohio mound sites, he was connecting the Petrolia discovery to a much larger and more charged debate about who had built what on this continent and why. The connection was not just symbolic, it was potentially physical, because the Ohio Hopewell sites and the older earthworks of the Great Lakes region were not isolated phenomenon. They were connected by trade networks that moved copper from Lake Superior to the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, marine shells from Florida to the forests of Ontario. The Hopewell people were not primitive villagers trading trinkets across short distances. They were sophisticated long-distance merchants operating a continent-wide exchange system that lasted for centuries, and their goods turned up in underground contexts, in burial chambers, in cache pits, in enclosed spaces beneath the surface of the earth that served ritual functions we are still trying to fully understand. The chamber on MacDougall's farm sat in a landscape that had been part of this exchange network. The land around Petrolia, in the far southwestern corner of Ontario near the border with Michigan, was connected by river routes to the Great Lakes and through them to the entire Hopewell trade sphere. If something had been built underground in that hill, it would not have been built in isolation. It would have been built by people who knew how to build, who had traditions of building, who perhaps had been building similar things across this landscape for a very long time. Hartley understood this. The schoolteacher from Sarnia may have been an amateur, but he was a thoughtful one. In his journal entry describing his second visit to the site, he wrote something that reads almost like a prophecy given what we now know about North American prehistory. He wrote that the chamber was not an accident, but an expression, that it represented a way of relating to the earth that was older than anything the settler world had brought to this continent, and that its existence demanded a revision of everything they thought they understood about who had been here before them. Nobody paid much attention to William Hartley. He was a schoolteacher. He had no institutional affiliation. His journal circulated among a small group of regional history enthusiasts and then faded from view for decades. But the chamber remained, and gradually, more people started asking the same questions he had asked. What was this place? How old was it really? And what had it been used for? The first person to attempt a serious, systematic answer to those questions was a man named Dr. Thomas B. Whitmore, a physician in Sarnia who had developed a passionate side interest in what he called the Aboriginal antiquities of Upper Canada. Whitmore was not a trained archaeologist, but he was methodical in a way that Hartley was not. Where Hartley observed and recorded, Whitmore measured and catalogued. He made multiple trips to the MacDougall site over the course of 1,898 and 1,899, carefully excavating the interior of the chamber in sections and keeping detailed records of exactly what he found and where. His report, submitted to the Ontario Historical Society in 1900 and received with considerable skepticism, described a structure even more sophisticated than early accounts had suggested. The stone fitting on the walls was not random. It showed evidence of planning, of intention, of a builder who had a clear picture in their mind of what they were making before they made it. The floor, where it was preserved, was composed of flat stones laid in a pattern that Whitmore described as resembling herringbone, a labour-intensive arrangement that served no purely practical purpose. It was aesthetic. It was chosen. There were also features he had not expected. In the wall opposite the main entrance, which was a low passage barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, there was an opening, not a crack or a collapse, but a deliberate opening, roughly circular, positioned at about chest height when standing. It led into darkness. Whitmore's candle, pushed through the opening, illuminated a second, smaller space beyond. Another chamber, connected to the first. Together, the two spaces formed what appeared to be a complex, a designed arrangement with distinct areas that may have served distinct functions. He found no burials in either space, no human remains at all. What he did find, in the second, smaller chamber, was a concentration of objects that he catalogued with painstaking care. Ceramic fragments, some showing what appeared to be deliberate surface treatment, a kind of burnishing or slip coating that he had seen described in reports of Hopewell pottery from Ohio sites. Several pieces of worked copper, thin and irregular, but clearly shaped rather than naturally occurring. A cluster of small stones of a type not found locally, greenish in colour, smooth, that Whitmore believed had been transported to the site from somewhere else. And one thing that he almost did not include in his report, because he was afraid it would not be believed. A fragment of what appeared to be textile. Woven fabric. Partially carbonized, but preserving enough structure to show the pattern of its weave, in a chamber that, by Whitmore's calculation, had been sealed for at minimum several hundred years, possibly much longer. Textiles do not survive well. Everyone in the archaeological world knew that, in 1900, organic materials decompose, wood rots, bone dissolves, fabric disintegrates. To find a textile fragment in an underground chamber in Ontario and have it be old enough to predate European contact was either a remarkable stroke of preservational luck or evidence that the conditions inside that chamber had been unusually stable. The low temperatures of an underground space, the relative dryness if no water had penetrated, the sealed environment. These conditions could, in theory, preserve organic materials far longer than exposed sites. Whitmore believed the textile was real. He believed it was old. He included it in his catalogue with a careful description and a note of appropriate scientific caution. He did not claim it proved anything on its own. He said it warranted further investigation. The Ontario Historical Society's response was polite and ultimately dismissive. The report was acknowledged. A short summary was included in their annual bulletin. No further investigation was funded. No formal excavation was mounted. The artifacts Whitmore had collected were accepted into storage at the Society's repository, where most of them remained uncatalogued and unexamined for the better part of 40 years. The chamber sat in McDougall's Hill. The questions sat unanswered, and the larger story of what lay beneath the surface of pre-colonial Ontario continued to accumulate evidence in fragments and rumours, and the occasional explosive newspaper story that briefly caught public attention and then faded as quickly as it had come. Here is something that most Canadian history courses will never tell you. Ontario is riddled with earthworks, not the dramatic, sky-reaching mounds of the Mississippi Valley, but low, subtle, difficult to see unless you know what you are looking for. Ridges that seem too straight to be natural, berms that form perfect arcs across hillsides, depressions in the landscape that do not match any geological explanation, but that match, almost exactly, the footprint of known enclosure types from the Hopewell cultural sphere. These features have been recorded, dismissed, forgotten, and rediscovered multiple times over the past 2 centuries. Ontario. Iroquoian archaeologists, working in the mid-20th century, documented dozens of sites across southwestern Ontario that showed signs of deliberate landscape modification. Most of these were interpreted in the most conservative possible terms, as the remnants of village palisades, as middens, as post patterns from longhouse communities. The possibility that some of them might represent something older, something more ceremonial, something connected to the broader tradition of earthwork construction that flourished across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley for over 1,000 years, was rarely explored in depth. Part of this was disciplinary conservatism. Archaeology is a field that rightly demands evidence before making claims, and the evidence for Ontario's participation in the Hopewell Exchange Network was, for a long time, considered circumstantial. Yes, Hopewell copper and Hopewell-style ceramics were found at Ontario sites. Yes, certain burial practices showed parallels with Ohio Valley traditions. But the direct evidence for earthwork construction, comparable to what existed further south, was harder to pin down. Then came the aerial photography. In the 1970s and 1980s, when archaeologists began using aerial surveys systematically to map Ontario's archaeological landscape, the picture changed dramatically. From the air, patterns invisible from the ground became unmistakable. There were enclosures, not everywhere, not densely concentrated the way they were in Ohio, but present, real, deliberate. In several cases, these enclosures corresponded to areas where oral traditions spoke of places with particular sacred significance. The overlap between the archaeological record and the oral record was present often enough to be meaningful. What it suggested was a landscape that had been deliberately shaped over centuries by people who understood both practical construction and symbolic geography. A landscape where above-ground earthworks and below-ground chambers might exist side by side as part of the same ceremonial system, where what was built above the earth was the visible expression of something that extended below it. The McDougall chamber, seen in this light, was not an anomaly. It was a data point in a much larger picture. Understanding that picture requires going back further in time than most people expect. The story of sophisticated pre-colonial architecture in eastern North America does not begin with the Hopewell culture. It begins with the Poverty Point culture of Louisiana, active from roughly 1700 BCE to 1000 BCE. Poverty Point is a series of enormous concentric ridges built entirely by hand from basket loads of transported earth, at the center of a continent-wide exchange network that moved copper from Lake Superior, flint from Ohio, and soapstone from the Appalachians across thousands of miles. The architectural tradition it represents did not spring into existence fully formed. It extended northward, through the Great Lakes, and into what is now Ontario. When you place the McDougall chamber in this context, it becomes less of a curiosity and more of an inheritance. A local expression of a tradition that stretched back millennia. The people who built that room near Petrolia were not inventing something new. They were practicing something very old. But who were they, specifically? That question is harder to answer with certainty, and the attempt to answer it runs directly into the complicated politics of Indigenous identity and colonial history in Canada. The short answer, the one that most archaeologists today would give you, is that the people who built structures like the McDougall Chamber were the ancestors of the nations that were still living in southwestern Ontario when Europeans arrived. The Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and their predecessors. These were not separate, vanished peoples. They were the parents and grandparents and great-grandparents of people whose descendants are still in southwestern Ontario today. The longer answer is more complicated, because the cultural and demographic history of the Great Lakes region in the centuries before European contact was not static. There were movements of peoples. There were confederacies formed and broken. There were periods of conflict, and periods of trade, and periods of what appears to have been deliberate cultural synthesis, where different groups adopted each other's architectural and ceremonial practices. The Hopewell tradition, whatever exactly it was something shared across a wide area by people who did not all speak the same language or belong to the same political group. It was, in some sense, a cultural package that crossed ethnic lines. So when we ask who built the chamber, the answer is probably not a single people, but a moment in a long history of building practices that were shared, modified, passed on, and eventually integrated into the oral and ceremonial traditions that survived into the period of European contact and beyond. The Wendat Confederacy, whose territory included much of southern Ontario in the centuries immediately before European arrival, had traditions of semi-subterranean ceremonial architecture. Their council houses, known from both historical accounts and archaeological excavation, often incorporated partially underground spaces where important deliberations and rituals were conducted. The symbolism of descending below the surface of the earth, entering a space that was literally inside the land, was powerful in their cosmological understanding. Below the surface was not just a practical matter of insulation and stability, it was a spiritual one. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it completely reframes what we are talking about when we discuss these underground spaces. They were not just rooms. They were not just practical shelters against the cold. They were deliberate acts of cosmological engagement. In many indigenous traditions across North America, the world is organized along a vertical axis. Above the surface is one realm, the realm of the sky and the sun and the celestial powers. Below the surface is another, the realm of the ancestors, of water, of the deep powers that sustain life. To build a space underground was to create a meeting point between the human world and the world below. To enter it was to cross a threshold, the ash and charcoal that Whitmore found in the inner chamber of the McDougall site. The worked copper, which in Hopewell and related traditions was one of the most ritually significant materials in existence. The carefully laid stone floor, the deliberate second chamber, accessible only through a narrow passage. All of these features make much more sense in a ceremonial context than in a purely practical one. This was not a storage space or a root cellar. It was a place of specific meaning, a place where particular things were done and particular ideas were enacted. What ideas? We cannot know for certain. The people who built and used this chamber left no written records. Their traditions were transmitted orally through story and ceremony, and the disruptions of colonial contact, the forced relocations, the residential schools, the systematic suppression of indigenous religious practices, all of these fractured the transmission of that oral knowledge in ways that are still being repaired today. But there are threads. There are stories that have survived, passed down by elders who refused to let them die even when it was dangerous to keep them alive. And some of those stories, when you hold them up against the archaeological record, illuminate the record in ways that pure material analysis never could. Among the Anishinaabe, there are traditions of places called sacred lodges beneath the earth, places where the great Midawuwin ceremonies, the ceremonies of the Grand Medicine Society, were sometimes conducted in underground spaces, specifically because the underground carried a particular spiritual power. The Midawuwin is one of the most significant ceremonial traditions in the Great Lakes region, a healing and spiritual maintenance system that has been practiced continuously for centuries, and that includes, within its teachings, explicit references to an ancient time when important ceremonies were conducted in chambers below the surface. This does not mean the McDougall chamber was a Midawuwin lodge. It may be too early chronologically, or the cultural affiliation may be different, but it points toward a tradition of underground ceremonial space that was real, that was persistent, and that had deep roots in the spiritual life of the peoples of this region. The chamber was not an anomaly. It was an expression. Let's talk about what was happening in the rest of North America while all of this was unfolding in Ontario. Because one of the things that makes the McDougall chamber story so interesting and so unsettling for official history is that it did not exist in isolation. It was part of a continent-wide pattern of pre-colonial underground architecture that was being discovered, documented, and then systematically ignored throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Ohio, the work of Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis in the 1840s had already revealed the staggering complexity of what the Hopewell people had built. Their survey, published in 1848 as Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was the first systematic documentation of the earthworks of the Midwest. It covered mound complexes stretching for miles, geometric earthworks aligned to astronomical events, burial chambers containing the remains of hundreds of individuals, along with trade goods from every corner of the continent. Among the features Squire and Davis documented were underground chambers. Not just burial pits, but what appeared to be deliberately constructed enclosed spaces beneath some of the mounds. Chambers with defined walls, sometimes lined with bark or timber that had long since rotted, but whose dimensions could still be traced in the pattern of decomposed organic material in the soil. In some cases, the chambers had been sealed after use, the entrance deliberately packed with earth. In others, they appeared to have been left accessible, as if their builders had intended to return. These chambers had been used for burial, certainly, but they had also been used for other things. The artifacts recovered from some of them, musical instruments, carved figures, vessels containing what appeared to be ritual substances, suggested that the chambers were active ceremonial spaces during the life of the community, not just places of final deposit for the dead. The parallel with the McDougall site was not perfect. The Ohio Hopewell chambers were generally larger, more elaborate, and associated with the great mound complexes in ways that the Ontario chamber was not. But the underlying concept, the underground enclosed space used for ritual purposes, was the same, and the tradition that produced both was the same broad cultural practice of constructing meaningful space below the surface that stretched across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Further north, in Minnesota, similar discoveries were being made in the late 19th century. Settlers clearing land for agriculture kept turning up what they called root cellars, but that clearly weren't. Constructed spaces too old, too carefully built, containing materials too deliberately placed to be simple farm storage. A particularly interesting case emerged from the area around Mille Lacs Lake in central Minnesota, where a series of connected underground chambers was discovered during road construction in 1891. The chambers were lined with granite slabs fitted together without mortar. They had a deliberate orientation, the main entrance facing a specific direction, which the local newspaper reporter noted was roughly southeast, consistent with a sunrise alignment. No thorough investigation was conducted. The chambers were documented by a local physician, and then mostly sealed again as the road construction proceeded. But the newspaper accounts were preserved, and when researchers began looking at them decades later, the similarities to both the Ohio Hopewell Chamber traditions and the McDougall site in Ontario were striking. And then there was Quebec. Eastern Canada's archaeological record has always been treated as somewhat separate from the Hopewell sphere, which is centered further west and south. But French-Canadian archaeologists working in the mid-20th century began to document what they called fosses ceremoniales, ceremonial pits, across the St. Lawrence Valley and into the Laurentian Hills. Some of these were simple, clearly funerary contexts, but others were more complex, multi-chambered, deliberately sealed, associated with trade goods of distant origin. The most dramatic of these Quebec sites was documented near Rivière-du-Loup in the 1950s, where construction workers broke into a structure the lead archaeologist called the most complex pre-contact underground construction I have encountered in 30 years. 3 chambers, connected passages, walls of fitted limestone, evidence of repeated use over several centuries. The report was filed. The site was partially excavated. Most was destroyed when construction resumed. This pattern repeats throughout the history of pre-colonial underground architecture in North America. Discovery, initial excitement, partial documentation, institutional inertia, eventual obscurity. Why? Several reasons. Academic archaeology pushes toward the locally verifiable, and connecting a single Ontario chamber to a continent-wide tradition requires a kind of synthetic thinking that individual researchers working on single sites rarely pursue. Acknowledging the full sophistication of pre-colonial indigenous architecture complicates the story of European settlement, and the political will for that acknowledgement was absent for most of the 20th century. And many of these structures simply do not survive. Built of materials that degrade, located in landscapes under continuous development pressure, they were destroyed faster than they could be documented. But the picture that emerges when you put the available evidence together, from Petrolia to the Ohio Valley to the Minnesota Lakes to the St. Lawrence, is coherent. It points toward a tradition of underground construction that was widespread, long-lasting, and deeply meaningful to the peoples who practiced it. A tradition that deserves to be part of the standard story of North American prehistory, and is not. John McDougall had no way of knowing any of this when he drove his shovel into the hill in the spring of 1897. He was a farmer, clearing land. He found a room. He told the newspaper, and the newspaper told the town. And the town was briefly fascinated, and then moved on. But the room remained, and the questions it raised did not go away. They just went underground, where, perhaps appropriately, they continued to accumulate and grow, and wait for the moment when someone would finally dig them up and bring them into the light. That moment is still not fully here, but it is closer than it has ever been. Let's talk about copper, because copper is one of the great unspoken stories of North American prehistory, and it is directly relevant to what was found in the chambers we have been discussing. The copper pieces recovered from the McDougall site were not accidental inclusions. Copper, in the context of Great Lakes pre-colonial archaeology, was never accidental. It was sacred. It was powerful. It was the material above all others that marked a site as significant. Lake Superior contains the world's largest deposit of native copper, copper that occurs in pure metallic form rather than embedded in ore, and that can be worked cold by hammering without smelting. Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region had been mining and working this copper for at least 5,000 years, before European contact, producing sheets, beads, ornaments, tools, and ritual objects that were traded across the entire continent. The scale of the ancient copper trade is staggering. Archaeological sites from Florida to the Rocky Mountains contain Lake Superior copper. The Hopewell sites in Ohio are full of it. great copper breastplates, copper ear spools, copper-covered mound offerings. At some Hopewell burial sites, individual burials contain hundreds of copper objects. The sheer quantity suggests a level of organized production and long-distance exchange that challenges every assumption about the economic sophistication of pre-agricultural North American societies. The copper in the McDougall chamber was not elaborate. The pieces Whitmore described were small, thin, irregular. They did not look like finished objects so much as raw material, copper sheet that had been cut or hammered into approximate shapes. This is interesting in itself. It suggests the chamber was not a burial of finished goods, the kind of deliberate funeral offering that characterized the great Hopewell mounds. It was something else, a working space perhaps, a place where materials were stored or prepared, a place where something was being made or was going to be made. That possibility, that the chamber was an active workspace rather than a passive storage or burial site, opens up a different set of questions about how it was used. Who had access to it? How often was it entered? What was the relationship between the physical space and whatever activities were conducted inside it? Was it always underground? Or was there a time when it was above ground, when the hill had not yet grown over it? That last question is important. It points to a feature of these sites that archaeologists often underemphasize. The hills under which these chambers are found are not always natural. Some of them are earthworks themselves. The hill on McDougall's farm may have been, in its earlier form, a constructed mound that was then either deliberately buried or gradually covered over by natural erosion and vegetation growth over centuries. If that is the case, the chamber would have been built first and the hill raised around it, which is a very different construction logic from simply tunneling into an existing hill. This kind of mound-over-chamber architecture is documented at numerous Hopewell sites in Ohio. The sequence of construction was often elaborate. A chamber was built at ground level, used for ceremonies or storage, and then sealed and covered with earth, creating the mound above. The act of covering the chamber was itself a ritual act. It did not mean the space was abandoned, it meant it was transformed. It became part of the earth itself, present but no longer directly accessible, its contents preserved and protected within the body of the mound. If the McDougall site followed this logic, then the chamber was not hidden, it was made permanent. The farmer's shovel broke through not just soil, but a deliberate act of preservation, carried out by people who wanted whatever was in that room to last. There is a man who enters this story at a critical moment, and his name is Andrew Hunter. He was a Canadian schoolteacher turned amateur archaeologist, which in the late 19th century was not the contradiction it might sound today. The formal discipline of archaeology in Canada was barely formed. There were no university programs, no professional societies, no standardized excavation methodology. The people who did the actual work of documenting pre-colonial sites were, by necessity, amateurs, farmers, physicians, clergy, teachers, people who cared enough to look and write down what they found. Hunter was better than most. He had been systematically documenting what he called Indian remains in Simcoe County on the southern shore of Georgian Bay since the 1880s. He had a methodical approach, a clear sense of what he was looking for, and a network of correspondents across Ontario who kept him informed when things were found. When word reached him about the McDougall discovery, he made the journey to Petrolia and spent several days at the site in 1899. What Hunter added to the accumulated record of the chamber was context. He had spent 20 years studying the Huron and pre-Huron sites of the Georgian Bay region, and he knew the material culture of late woodland period Ontario better than almost anyone in the province. When he examined the ceramics from the McDougall site, he recognized features that placed them within a specific stylistic tradition that was older than the Wendat material he was used to working with. Not dramatically older, not prehistoric in the sense of thousands of years, but older. Pre-contact in a meaningful sense, meaning that whoever had made and used these vessels had not yet encountered European goods, European metals, European diseases that would reshape and reduce the populations of the region so catastrophically in the 17th century. His estimate, written carefully in the letter he sent to Whitmore after his visit, was that the chamber had been in active use sometime between 1200 and 1500 CE. That was a range of 300 years, broad enough to be honest about the limitations of ceramic dating, but narrow enough to be genuinely informative. 1200 to 1500 CE in Ontario meant the time of the Iroquoian transition, the period when the culture that would become the Wendat Confederacy was consolidating and developing its distinctive forms of social organization and material culture. But Hunter also noted something Whitmore had mentioned only in passing: the construction of the chamber itself, the stone fitting, the architectural choices. These did not feel to him like late woodland Iroquoian work. They felt older. The Iroquoian tradition in Ontario was associated with longhouse villages, with above-ground communal architecture, with specific patterns of settlement and ceramic production that Hunter knew well. The chamber did not fit neatly into that tradition. He raised, cautiously, the possibility that the chamber was built earlier than the ceramics suggested, that it had been built during one period and then reused during another, that the ceramic material and the copper pieces represented the most recent occupation of a space that had been constructed considerably earlier. This kind of multi-phase occupation is actually common in archaeology. Sites are reused, spaces are adapted. A chamber built in 800 CE might contain objects deposited in 1300 CE. The dating of the most recent use does not tell you when construction occurred. Distinguishing between construction date and occupation date requires careful stratigraphic analysis, ideally with radiocarbon dating of organic material from multiple levels. In 1899, radiocarbon dating did not exist. It would not be developed until the late 1940s. Hunter and Whitmore were working with ceramic typology and architectural style, tools that were genuinely informative, but that carried significant margins of error. Hunter's intuition that the chamber might be older than its most recent contents suggested was therefore difficult to test at the time, but it was not forgotten. When the Whitmore collection was eventually examined in the 1940s by a researcher at the Royal Ontario Museum named Sigmund Samuel, Hunter's letters were in the archive alongside Whitmore's report. Samuel's own analysis was constrained by the state of the collection. No organic material was suitable for the new radiocarbon dating technique. The copper was too degraded for metallurgical analysis. The textile fragments had been mounted on a backing card and treated with a preservative that precluded further analysis. But Samuel noted in a brief internal memo, not published but found by a researcher in the 1970s, that the architectural features of the chamber were unusual for the late woodland Ontario context. They were more consistent with construction traditions of the Middle Woodland period, the Hopewell era, roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE. If Samuel was right, the chamber was not 200 to 500 years old. It was 1500 to 2000 years old, predating European knowledge of this continent by more than a millennium. That memo sat in an institutional file for 30 years. When it was finally read by the archaeologist who found it, a woman named Dr. Patricia Burke, who was working on her doctorate on pre-contact Ontario at the University of Toronto in 1977, she immediately understood its significance. Burke was working in a very different intellectual climate. Radiocarbon dating was now standard. Paleobotanical analysis could extract information from the most fragmentary remains. The mound builder myth had been demolished. Indigenous peoples were increasingly recognized as the legitimate creators of the pre-colonial material culture that archaeologists were studying. Burke could not do much with the physical collection at that point. The artifacts had been through too many hands, too many inadequate storage conditions, too many well-meaning but destructive preservation treatments. What she could do was place Whitmore's and Hunter's and Samuel's observations within the current state of knowledge, and ask whether their intuitions, discounted and ignored for decades, might actually be correct. Her conclusion, published as a short article in a regional archaeology journal in 1979, was that the evidence for an early woodland or early middle woodland construction date for the McDougall chamber was stronger than had been recognized. She was careful. She used phrases like consistent with rather than evidence of. She called for further investigation of the site, noting that the chamber's structural integrity as of the most recent visit by any researcher in the 1930s had been remarkably good, suggesting that a new excavation with modern methods might yield much more precise dating. The article was read by the relevant specialists. Some agreed with her assessment. Others were skeptical. One reviewer in particular, a professor at McMaster University, whose name does not need to be included here, dismissed her argument as overreach based on second-hand evidence and expressed doubt that a middle woodland construction would be found in that particular corner of southwestern Ontario, given the known distribution of Hopewell-affiliated sites at the time. That criticism was not entirely without merit. The Hopewell core area was in Ohio and Indiana. Ontario was a frontier zone, connected to the Hopewell sphere by trade, but not necessarily participating in its full architectural traditions. Finding a Hopewell period underground chamber in southwestern Ontario would have been an outlier, though not an impossibility. Burke's response to her critic, published in the same journal the following year, was measured but pointed. She noted that the known distribution of Hopewell-affiliated sites was a function of where archaeologists had looked and what they had been looking for, not necessarily a complete picture of where Hopewell-influenced construction had actually occurred. She cited the Minnesota and Quebec examples. She pointed to the copper, which was unambiguously connected to the Lake Superior trade network that the Hopewell people had dominated. And she raised what was perhaps her most powerful point. The absence of a thing from the official record does not mean the thing was absent. It may mean it was not found. It may mean it was found and not recognized. It may mean it was found, recognized, and then not thought important enough to push into the mainstream. The history of pre-colonial archaeology in Canada was full of exactly those moments. Things found and forgotten, things recognized and ignored, things that did not fit the expected picture being set aside rather than used to revise the picture. The McDougall chamber was one of those things, and it was time, Burke argued, to stop treating it as such. Her call for further investigation was not answered in 1979 or 1980, or in the decade that followed. Funding was limited. The site's ownership had changed hands multiple times since McDougall's death in the early 20th century. The farmland had been partially developed and partially sold to an agricultural corporation. Accessing the site for excavation required navigating a tangle of ownership, liability, and institutional approval that nobody was quite prepared to take on. But Burke's article created a thread, a thin one, but a real one, something to pull on. And in the 1990s, someone began to pull. The 1990s were a complicated time for Canadian archaeology and for the relationship between archaeology and Indigenous communities. The passage of NAGPRA in the United States in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, had no direct Canadian equivalent, but it shifted the conversation on both sides of the border. Indigenous communities were increasingly asserting their right to be involved in decisions about archaeological work on their ancestral lands. Institutions were being forced, sometimes reluctantly, to reconsider the ownership of materials they had been holding for decades without consultation. In Ontario specifically, this meant that any new archaeological work touching pre-colonial Indigenous sites required consultation with relevant First Nations communities. This was not just a bureaucratic hurdle. For the researchers who took it seriously, it was an opportunity to access a form of knowledge that the official archaeological record had almost entirely ignored. Oral tradition, community memory, the living connection between contemporary Indigenous people and the places their ancestors had shaped. The person who began pulling on Burke's thread in the early 1990s was a young researcher named Marcus Bellamy, who was doing his master's research on the archaeology of pre-contact ceremonial sites in southwestern Ontario. He had read Burke's 1979 article as an undergraduate, and it had stayed with him. When he began designing his research project, he made two decisions that shaped everything that followed. First, he decided to consult with elders from the Amjivnang First Nation, whose traditional territory included the Petrolia area. He went to them not with a proposal but with questions. He asked if they knew anything about the hill on the old MacDougall property. He asked about oral traditions connected to that area. He asked what they could tell him about underground spaces in the landscape of southwestern Ontario. The conversations required time, relationship building, and genuine listening. The elders did not produce a specific oral account of the construction or use of the chamber, but they spoke of places in the landscape that were below and in, places where connection to the underrealm was possible, of ceremonies conducted in partially underground spaces, of a tradition, longer than could be counted in generations, of people who had known how to work with the land in these ways. One elder, a woman who asked that her name not be used, told Bellamy something specific. She said the hill was a known place, that it had a name in her grandmother's stories, roughly translated as the place where the earth remembers, and that in those stories the hill was not just a hill, it was an old thing, something made rather than grown, something that had been there longer than any living person could remember it being anything else. Bellamy's second decision was to attempt a new survey of the site itself, not a full excavation, which would have required far more funding and institutional backing than he had, but a ground-penetrating radar survey. GPR technology had become increasingly accessible to archaeological researchers through the 1980s and 1990s, and it offered a way to look beneath the surface without digging. Getting access to the site required months of negotiation. The property had passed through several owners since the Agricultural Corporation had sold off various parcels in the 1970s. The portion of the original MacDougall land that included the hill was by the early 1990s part of a larger landholding owned by a family who were aware of the historical story but had no particular investment in it. They eventually agreed to allow the survey after Bellamy met with them several times and explained what he was hoping to find. The GPR results were extraordinary. The chamber Whitmore had documented was still there. The radar clearly showed a void beneath the surface of the hill, approximately where Whitmore's measurements would have placed it. Its dimensions matched. The double chamber configuration Whitmore had described, the larger outer room and the smaller inner one, connected by a narrow passage, was visible in the radar data as two distinct voids, with a connecting feature between them. But there was more. The radar showed additional anomalies beneath the hill that Whitmore had not described. A third void, smaller than either of the two documented chambers, located deeper and to the northwest, a feature along what appeared to be the eastern slope of the hill that might be a passage or a partially collapsed tunnel. And most intriguingly, a pattern of soil density variations across a large area around the base of the hill that was consistent with, though not conclusive evidence of, deliberate earthwork construction. The hill itself, or at least its lower sections, might have been artificially shaped, augmented, built up from surrounding soil, rather than simply natural. If that was correct, it meant the hill was not just a natural feature into which a chamber had been inserted. The hill was partly a constructed mound. The chamber had been built as part of a larger architectural project that had raised the earth around it. This changed everything. Or it would have, if the results had been published widely and taken up by the broader archaeological community. But Bellamy was a master's student, working with borrowed GPR equipment and limited institutional backing. He wrote up his findings carefully and submitted them as his thesis. The thesis was accepted, praised by his committee, and filed in the library at Western University where it sat for years, consulted occasionally, but never published in a peer-reviewed journal in a form that would have guaranteed it wider attention. The reasons were partly practical. Bellamy went into environmental consulting after his master's and never completed the PhD that would have given him the standing and the resources to push the research further. The site remained inaccessible for full excavation. The GPR results, while suggestive, were not definitive, and without excavation to confirm what the radar was showing, it was difficult to publish strong claims. But the results were known. They circulated among the small community of researchers interested in pre-contact Ontario archaeology. Burke read them and referenced them in a subsequent article. Other researchers cited Bellamy's thesis. The chain of evidence grew longer. And then, in the mid-2000s, something happened that put the McDougall site back in the news for the first time since the original 1897 reports. A local history enthusiast named Colin Fenwick, who had grown up in Petrolia and had been aware of the McDougall story since childhood, began writing about it online. His posts were detailed, well-researched, and accessible in a way that academic archaeology rarely is. He synthesized the Whitmore report, the Hunter letters, Burke's articles, and Bellamy's thesis into a coherent narrative and published it on a regional history website that attracted significant attention. Within weeks, the story had been picked up by several Canadian history blogs and then by some of the larger platforms devoted to historical mysteries and alternative archaeology. This was where things got complicated, because the story of the McDougall chamber, once it reached the world of online alternative history, began to attract interpretations that its original investigators would not have recognized or endorsed. Suddenly, it was evidence of Norse exploration of the Great Lakes, or of a lost Celtic presence in pre-colonial Canada, or of the mysterious Solutrean people, a now largely discredited theory that postulated pre-Columbian European migration to North America across the North Atlantic, or, in the most extreme versions, of ancient civilizations with no known historical parallel that had built underground cities across the continent. None of these interpretations were supported by the evidence. The chamber was not Norse, it was not Celtic, it was not Solutrean. It was the product of a long tradition of indigenous underground construction rooted in the Hopewell sphere and extending through the late woodland period. That story was fascinating enough on its own terms. It did not need dragons or Vikings to make it interesting, but the drift toward sensationalism had a cost. When the alternative history crowd embraced the McDougall chamber, professional archaeologists pulled back. The story became associated in their minds with the fringe, with bad scholarship, with the kind of irresponsible speculation that has historically been used to deny indigenous peoples credit for their own cultural achievements. Some researchers who might otherwise have been willing to publish on the topic decided it was better to stay away from a story that had become too hot, too contaminated by association with theories they found embarrassing. This is a tragedy of a particular kind. The McDougall chamber does not need to be mysterious in the alien contact sense to be worth taking seriously. The true history is stranger and richer and more deeply human than any of those invented alternatives. But the damage was done. The story entered a kind of limbo, taken seriously by too few serious people, and too seriously by people who were not particularly careful with evidence. Let's step back from the specific site for a moment and think about the bigger question. The question that the McDougall chamber opens, but does not answer by itself. The question of what pre-colonial North America actually looked like to the people who were living in it. We have a deeply impoverished picture of this, not because the evidence does not exist, but because the evidence has been systematically minimized, misinterpreted, or attributed to anyone other than the indigenous people who created it. The mound builder myth was the most dramatic version of this tendency, but it was not the only one. Across the continent, wherever evidence of sophisticated pre-colonial construction or organization appeared, there was a reflex in the settler scientific community to find an alternative explanation that did not credit indigenous peoples. Part of this reflex was ideological. If you are occupying land you took from people who you have told yourself were living in a state of natural simplicity, compatible with but not truly owning the landscape, then evidence that those people were building rooms under hills and trading copper across continents is inconvenient. It does not fit the story, so it gets set aside. But part of it was also cognitive. Human beings have a tendency to underestimate what can be accomplished with simple tools and abundant time and communal effort. A chamber with fitted stone walls, requiring no mortar, requiring no metal tools, requiring no machinery beyond the human body, and the lever and the basket, feels impossible to us because we have outsourced our physical intelligence. We no longer know how to look at a piece of stone and see how it could fit against another piece of stone. We no longer have the skill, built up over years of practice, to select exactly the right rock and place it exactly right so that it bears weight without mortar. But the people who built these chambers had that skill. It was part of their education, passed down through apprenticeship from those who had the knowledge to those who were learning it. It was not magic. It was not alien technology. It was skill. And skill, given enough time and enough dedication, can accomplish things that look miraculous from the outside. The ancient copper mines of Isle Royale in Lake Superior are a good example of what that sustained effort looks like at scale. The miners had no metal tools, only fire, water, and stone hammers. Over 5,000 years, they extracted hundreds of millions of pounds of copper, one of the most productive mining operations in the ancient world. The people who mined that copper were the cultural ancestors of those who built the Hopewell Mounds and the chamber beneath the hill on John McDougall's farm. This was not a simple or primitive world. It was a complex, organized, technically competent world that operated on different principles than the European world that eventually encountered it. But that was not inferior to that world in any meaningful sense, and in some respects was considerably more sophisticated. The specific kind of sophistication we see in the underground chamber tradition, the ability to read a landscape, select appropriate sites, construct stable underground spaces that would last centuries, and integrate those spaces into a broader ceremonial and social system, reflects a kind of environmental intelligence that European civilization was in the process of abandoning at the same moment that it was expanding across the globe. The shift to agriculture and then to urbanization progressively disconnected European and European-derived cultures from the deep landscape knowledge that indigenous peoples maintained. What looked like primitive attachment to the land was actually the accumulated result of thousands of years of careful observation and learned relationship with a specific environment. The underground chamber was one expression of that relationship. It was not just a building. It was a statement about how human beings and the earth relate to each other. A statement that says the surface is not the only place where life happens. That the ground beneath your feet is not just substrate, but a living system with its own powers and properties. That to know a place fully, you need to know what lies below it as much as what rises above it. This understanding has deep roots in the cosmological traditions of many North American indigenous peoples. In Haudenosaunee tradition, the creation story involves Sky Woman falling from the sky world onto a turtle's back, the turtle being this world, and the earth growing from mud, brought up from the bottom of the primordial water. The vertical axis, sky above, earth at the surface, water and spirit world below, is fundamental to the understanding of how the world is organized and how human beings must relate to each. The underground is not simply the underworld in a simple death realm sense. It is the realm of the ancestors, of the first powers, of the deep knowledge that sustains life. To build a chamber underground, to descend into it for ceremony or deliberation or the keeping of sacred objects, was to participate in that cosmological structure. It was an act of theology as much as architecture. You were literally putting yourself in right relationship with the world by entering the chamber. You were acknowledging that the earth had depth, and that depth mattered, and you were preserving something. The objects placed in chambers, like the one McDougall found, were not casual deposits. They were deliberate choices made by people who understood that what they placed in the earth would be protected there in ways that above-ground storage could not guarantee. The cold, the stability, the sealing off from weather and disturbance, all of these preserved material objects. But more than the objects themselves, these chambers preserved the idea. They were places where the past was held, where the knowledge of what had been done was kept available for those who knew how to access it. In this sense, the McDougall chamber was a kind of library. Not a library of text, because these were not people who used text, but a library of material evidence, of objects and spaces and relationships that encoded knowledge about who these people were and what they valued and how they understood their place in the world. The room that John McDougall found in 1897 was not empty. It was full of meaning that had been carefully placed there and then sealed in with the intention of lasting. And it did last. Whatever else happened to it, whatever was removed or disturbed or misidentified in the century and more since its discovery, The chamber itself lasted. The walls held. The floor survived. The structure that someone built in that hill, 200 or 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 years before a Canadian farmer's shovel broke through the surface, had endured. That endurance is its own kind of message. Now we need to talk about what the chamber might specifically have been used for. Because we have been speaking in general terms about ceremony and ritual and cosmological significance, but there are specific traditions and specific practices that the archaeological evidence points toward. The Midewiwin, the Grand Medicine Society of the Anishinaabe peoples, is one of the most important ceremonial institutions in the Great Lakes region. Its origins are the subject of debate among scholars, with estimates ranging from a few centuries to several millennia. Its practices involve a multi-stage initiation system, healing ceremonies, and the maintenance of sacred objects. Birch bark scrolls on which the songs and teachings of the society are recorded, copper pieces, shells, and other items of ceremonial significance. The Midewiwin is traditionally associated with specific kinds of ceremonial spaces, lodges that are constructed in particular ways, oriented in particular directions, associated with specific landscape features, and in some accounts, both oral, historical, and ethnographic. The tradition includes references to underground spaces that served as places of particular power. The copper pieces found in the McDougall chamber, the careful architectural construction, the double chamber configuration with a narrow connecting passage, the evidence of fire use in the inner space. These features, taken together, are consistent with what we know of Midewiwin ceremonial architecture and practice in the Great Lakes region. This does not mean the chamber was specifically a Midewiwin lodge. The chronological range is uncertain enough that it could predate the Midewiwin as we know it in its current form. But it suggests that the McDougall chamber was part of a continuous tradition of Great Lakes ceremonial architecture that found its most fully developed expression in the Midewiwin and related institutions. The ceremonies conducted in these spaces were not casual. They were significant moments in the life of a community, requiring preparation, specific knowledge, and qualified participants. The space itself was consecrated, made sacred through the combination of its location, its construction, and the acts performed within it. Entry was not arbitrary. Exit was not without consequence. The chamber was a threshold, a place of transformation. When McDougall broke through its ceiling in 1897, he crossed that threshold without knowing it existed. And the history that followed, the documentation and the investigation and the dismissal and the forgetting and the gradual recovery, was in some ways the process of the modern world reckoning with what it had stumbled into, a tradition older than anything in the official history. A knowledge system that had been practicing its arts in the soil of this continent for millennia before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. That tradition did not end with colonization. It was suppressed, disrupted, damaged almost beyond recovery in some communities. But it was not ended. The elders who spoke to Bellamy in the early 1990s carried threads of it still. The Midewiwin is still practiced. The oral traditions that encode knowledge about these places are still being maintained, at great cost and with great dedication, by people who understand what is at stake if they are lost. There are other chambers. This is the part of the story that most accounts of the McDougall site miss entirely, because they treat it as a singular discovery rather than as one node in a network. But the evidence, scattered and imperfect as it is, points toward the existence of multiple underground constructed spaces in pre-colonial Ontario and the broader Great Lakes region. Let's trace some of them. The first case worth examining is from Lambton County itself, the same county as Petrolia, just 15 miles to the north, near the town of Thedford. In 1903, 6 years after the McDougall discovery, and almost certainly influenced by the local attention it had received, a farmer named James Rutherford found what he described in a letter to the London Free Press as a stone-lined pit of considerable size while digging the foundation for a new barn. He described a rectangular depression, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, walled with fitted limestone, containing what he called old things. including a flat stone with marks on it that he could not read. Rutherford's find received brief attention, but was dismissed more quickly than McDougall's, partly because the stone with marks turned out, under examination by a professor from Western University, to be a piece of glacially striated bedrock rather than carved inscription. The professor concluded the entire feature was a natural geological formation, and the story faded. But there is a detail in Rutherford's original letter that the professor did not address. The walls were fitted. Glacially striated bedrock does not produce fitted walls. Whatever the nature of the stone with marks, the construction of the space around it was deliberate. And the dimensions, 8 feet by 10 feet, are consistent with a storage or preparation chamber rather than the larger ceremonial spaces associated with major sites. It may have been a satellite feature, a secondary underground space associated with a nearby main construction that has never been found. The second case is better documented and comes from a completely different direction, from the work of an early 20th century Ontario archaeologist named William Winterberg. Winterberg was one of the first professionally trained archaeologists working in Canada, a staff member of the Geological Survey of Canada who spent decades documenting pre-contact sites across Ontario and Quebec. He is best known for his work on Iroquoian village sites, but in the 1920s he spent considerable time in southwestern Ontario, and his field notes from that period include several references to what he called anomalous subsurface features. One of these was a feature near the Grand River in Brant County, discovered during construction of a drainage ditch. Winterberg was called to the site after the construction crew reported finding structured stone underground. His notes describe a circular arrangement of stones, approximately 9 feet in diameter, at a depth of about 4 feet, with what appeared to be a deliberately prepared floor of compacted clay. He found no artifacts in the disturbed portion of the feature, which had been partially destroyed by the ditch, but he collected soil samples and noted the stratigraphy carefully. His conclusion in his field notes was non-committal, as field notes tend to be. He described it as possible evidence of a subsurface construction feature and noted that it warranted further investigation. The further investigation was never conducted. The drainage ditch was completed. The rest of the feature was destroyed. But Winterberg's field notes survived in the archive of what is now the Canadian Museum of History, and when Burke found them in the 1970s, she referenced the Brant County feature as supporting evidence for her argument about the distribution of pre-contact underground construction in Ontario. The third case is perhaps the most intriguing because it is the most recent and the most thoroughly documented. In 2011, during the construction of a water main in the town of Stratford in Perth County, a backhoe operator broke into an underground space that could not be explained as any kind of modern construction. The space was reported to the county archaeologist, who arrived within hours. What the archaeologist found was a chamber that, in its basic architecture, was strikingly similar to what Whitmore had described in his Petrolia report more than a century earlier. Fitted stone walls, a carefully prepared floor surface, evidence of closure, meaning the entrance or entrances had been deliberately sealed at some point. The dimensions were smaller than the McDougall chamber, roughly 7 feet by 9 feet, but the construction quality was comparable. The archaeologist, whose report is on file with the Ontario Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism and Culture Industries, conducted a rapid assessment excavation before the water main installation had to proceed. He found no human remains. He found ceramic fragments consistent with a late woodland date, though he noted that the construction style of the chamber itself seemed inconsistent with late woodland traditions and might suggest an earlier phase of construction. He found no organic material in sufficient condition for radiocarbon dating. His report recommended further investigation of the site, specifically targeted radiocarbon sampling from any organic material that might be found in less disturbed portions of the chamber, and consultation with relevant First Nations communities about the significance of the feature. The water main was installed, the chamber was sealed, the further investigation was never conducted. Read that again. A well-documented underground chamber with clear evidence of pre-contact construction was found, assessed, partially excavated, and then sealed without further investigation because a water main needed to be installed in 2011, not 1897, not 1930, in 2011. The reason is not malice. It is a combination of the practical, the financial, and the institutional. Archaeology, in the context of development projects, operates on tight timelines with limited resources. The rapid assessment process exists precisely because full archaeological investigation of every feature discovered during development would make construction impossible. Hard choices are made. Features that are found to be significant are flagged for further work, but that further work requires funding, staffing, and institutional will that may or may not materialize. In this case, it did not materialize. The Stratford Chamber sits sealed beneath a municipal water main. The report sits in a government archive. The feature has been recorded, technically, but it has not been investigated in any way that would answer the questions it raises. How old is it? What was it for? Is it connected to the MacDougall tradition? Or is it an entirely separate development? Is there more, underground and unseen, in the old core of Stratford and the surrounding landscape? Those questions are unanswered, and they will remain unanswered until someone finds the funding, the access, and the institutional backing to pursue them. There is a fourth case worth mentioning, from Manitoba, which extends the geographic range of this tradition further north and west than most accounts suggest. In the late 1990s, a team of archaeologists from the University of Manitoba, working in the Interlake region north of Winnipeg, documented a series of what they described as medicine bundle lodges, semi-subterranean structures associated with Siouan-speaking peoples of the post-contact era. These were not purely prehistoric features. Some of them were in use well into the 20th century. But their construction reflected a much older tradition of underground or partially underground ceremonial space that the researchers traced back to pre-contact times. What made the Manitoba sites particularly interesting was that the researchers were working closely with Indigenous community members who could speak directly to the function and meaning of these spaces. This was exactly what had been impossible for the earlier investigators of the Ontario sites. The oral and ceremonial traditions that gave the underground chambers their meaning had survived in Manitoba in a more continuous form than they had in heavily colonized southwestern Ontario, and the researchers were able to document not just the physical features, but the practices associated with them. The picture that emerged was consistent with what Ontario archaeology had suggested, but never confirmed from a living tradition. These spaces were places of concentrated spiritual power, used for healing and transformation, associated with copper and other sacred objects. Access was restricted to qualified individuals. They were understood as continuous, with a tradition stretching far back in time. The Manitoba findings provided exactly the ethnographic grounding that purely archaeological evidence from Ontario had always lacked. The tradition was not dead. It was living, damaged by colonization but not destroyed, still carried in communities that had survived. This was a real, sustained, geographically widespread tradition of underground ceremonial space, practiced in the Great Lakes region for at least 1,500 years and possibly much longer. John MacDougall's shovel broke through the ceiling of one expression of that tradition in 1897. His discovery was not the beginning of the story. It was a window into a story that was already thousands of years old. And the story is not over. Let's talk about the timeline in more detail, because the question of when the MacDougall chamber was built is not just an academic curiosity. It determines what tradition the chamber belongs to, who built it, what practices were associated with it, and what its discovery tells us about the pre-colonial history of Ontario. And the answer is genuinely uncertain, in ways that are worth understanding. The ceramic evidence, as interpreted by Hunter and confirmed by later analysts, points toward a date of active use, sometime between 1200 and 1500 CE. This would place the most recent period of occupation squarely within the Ontario-Iroquoian tradition, the culture that was developing into the Wendat Confederacy in the centuries before European contact. Wendat territory included parts of southwestern Ontario, and Wendat ceremonial practices included the use of special enclosed spaces for particular rituals. But several researchers, beginning with Samuel's internal memo and continuing through Burke's published analysis and Bellamy's architectural assessment, have argued that the construction itself may be older than the most recent ceramic deposits. The architectural style, the fitting of the stones, the double-chamber configuration, the specific orientation of the entrance passage, these features match the construction traditions of the earlier Middle Woodland period, which in the Ontario context falls between roughly 200 CE and 800 CE. Middle Woodland Ontario was a period of significant cultural activity and exchange. The people living in southwestern Ontario during this period were participating in the broader Hopewell Exchange network, trading copper and ceramics and other materials with groups across the Midwest and Great Lakes. Their own material culture showed influences from multiple directions, a synthesis of local traditions and imported practices. The architectural tradition of underground construction was part of this synthesis. It had roots in the Ohio Valley, where the Hopewell people had been building elaborate burial and ceremonial chambers for centuries. It had roots in the earlier Archaic period, when smaller-scale underground features had been part of the ritual landscape across eastern North America, and it found expression in Ontario as local communities adapted these ideas to their own needs and landscapes. If the McDougall chamber was built during the Middle Woodland period, it was built approximately 1500 to 1800 years before it was discovered. That would make it genuinely old by any standard. Older than the oldest cathedrals in Europe, older than most of the recognizable monuments of medieval civilization, old enough to span the gap between the Roman Empire and the modern world. And then it would have been used again, or simply found and its objects refreshed, sometime in the late pre-contact period, between 1200 and 1500 CE, by people who were not necessarily the direct descendants of its builders, but who recognized it, understood it in some sense, and related to it within their own ceremonial tradition. This kind of multi-generational engagement with very old sacred sites is not unusual in Indigenous traditions. Places of particular power are recognized and maintained across cultural transitions, even when the specific practices associated with them change. A third possibility exists. Some researchers have suggested the construction technique might be consistent with even earlier traditions, early woodland or Archaic period construction going back 2,000 or 3,000 years. The Watson Break site in Louisiana, the oldest known mound complex in North America, dates to approximately 3,400 BCE, older than Stonehenge. If this tradition had a northern extension into the Great Lakes region, underground construction in Ontario might have roots going back much further than any researcher has seriously proposed. We do not know. The evidence is insufficient. But the range of possibility, from 1,200 CE at the most conservative end to several thousand years earlier at the most expansive, tells us something important. The land of southwestern Ontario was not an empty landscape. It was shaped by human activity over a very long time, and that human shaping was not uniform or static. It evolved. The practices associated with underground ceremonial space in 1300 BCE were not the same as the practices associated with them in 300 CE, which were not the same as the practices in 1350 CE, but they were connected by a thread. A continuous tradition of understanding that the earth had depth, and that depth had meaning, and that human beings could build their relationship to that depth into the landscape itself. The chamber was one expression of that understanding, at one moment in time, but it was part of a conversation that had been going on for a very long time before McDougall's shovel interrupted it. Now let's talk about what has happened to the site in the century, and more since its discovery, because that story is itself a kind of history of how Canada has related to its pre-colonial past, and it is not an entirely encouraging one. In the decades immediately following the discovery, the site was essentially left to be what it was, MacDougall himself was not interested in turning it into a museum or a tourist attraction. He had a farm to run. The artifacts that had been removed were in the hands of Whitmore and the Ontario Historical Society. The chamber itself was still there, accessible to anyone who wanted to get to it, but on private property and not particularly well known outside of the regional history community. By the 1920s, the farmland had passed to MacDougall's son and then to a nephew, and the portion of the property that included the hill had been incorporated into a larger agricultural operation. There was some informal awareness in the local community that the hill had something under it, but no systematic effort to protect or investigate the site. The first real threat to the site came in the late 1940s when an oil company proposed to drill a test well near the hill. The Petrolia area sits on top of the Oil Springs Pool, one of the first commercially exploited oil fields in North America, and the landscape was riddled with old wells. A new well drilled close enough could have destroyed the chamber entirely. The well was not drilled, for commercial rather than archaeological reasons, but the threat illustrated how exposed the site was. As of the most recent information available, the hill is still there, still on private land, still largely uninvestigated beyond the Whitmore excavations and the Bellamy GPR survey. There is no heritage designation, no ongoing research program. The artifacts have been partially repatriated to local First Nations communities following consultations in the 2000s, but the physical site remains in legal and institutional limbo. Closing the gap between what exists on the landscape and what has been properly documented requires not just funding, but a fundamental shift in how Canadian society understands its relationship to pre-colonial history, recognizing that what lies beneath the surface is as much a part of national heritage as anything above it. Engaging Indigenous communities as partners rather than afterthoughts. Some progress has been made. Heritage legislation has improved. First Nations communities have more legal standing than a generation ago, but the MacDougall Chamber sits, largely unremarked, in a field in Lambton County, and the questions it raises remain unanswered. Here is something that rarely comes up in discussions of the MacDougall Chamber, and it should. The Petrolia area in the late 19th century was not just any farming community, it was one of the most economically significant regions in all of Canada. The reason was oil. Oil Springs, a few miles south of Petrolia, was the site of the world's first commercial oil well, drilled by James Miller Williams in 1858, predating Pennsylvania's famous Drake well by a year. By the 1860s, Petrolia was the center of a booming petroleum industry, with refineries, pipelines, international export operations. The town was known across North America as the oil capital of the world. By 1897, when MacDougall found the chamber, the great oil boom was past its peak, but the infrastructure and the wealth it had generated were still very much present. Petrolia was a town with money, with connections, with people who were educated and ambitious and interested in the wider world. It was not a backwater. When the newspaper ran the story of the underground room, it was read by people who had financial resources and social connections, and who were capable of mounting a real investigation if they chose to. The fact that a real investigation was never mounted is therefore not simply a matter of limited resources or limited knowledge. It was a choice. Collectively and implicitly, the community chose not to prioritize the investigation of what had been found. The oil industry and the agricultural economy and the rapid development of the region left no room for sustained attention to a room under a hill that was old and interesting, but did not produce profit. This economic context is worth keeping in mind, because it is not unique to Petrolia. It is the context in which most pre-colonial archaeological sites in North America have existed since the arrival of European settlement. The landscape has been under continuous development pressure for more than 2 centuries. Agricultural clearing, mineral extraction, infrastructure construction, urban expansion, all of these activities have been destroying pre-colonial sites at a rate that far outpaces the capacity of archaeologists to investigate them. We have, as a result, a record that is irretrievably incomplete. We will never know how many sites like the MacDougall Chamber have been simply destroyed without record in the course of the development of modern Canada. The holes that are now in our understanding of pre-colonial Ontario are not just the result of scholarly neglect or institutional bias. They are partly the physical result of the ground having been dug up, paved over, built upon, and otherwise irrevocably altered. This is a loss, not just an academic loss, a loss of data for researchers who study these things, a loss of heritage, a loss of the material record of the thousands of years of human life that preceded the brief 2 centuries of Canadian nationhood. A loss of something that belonged, in the most fundamental sense, not to Canada, but to the Indigenous peoples whose ancestors created it. The question of who these sites belong to is one that Canadian law and Canadian society have been slowly and imperfectly grappling with since at least the 1980s. The answer that Indigenous peoples themselves have consistently given, that the heritage belongs to their communities, that the knowledge embedded in these sites is part of their living cultural patrimony, has been acknowledged in principle more readily than it has been honoured in practice. The artefacts from the McDougall chamber that ended up in institutional collections, the ceramics, the copper pieces, the carved bone, the textile fragment, these were collected without consultation with any First Nations community. They were held for decades, without communication with the communities whose ancestors may have made and used them. Some of them have been returned following consultations in the early 2000s, an outcome that was years in the making and required sustained advocacy by community members who had never stopped knowing that the material belonged with them. The chamber itself cannot be returned, but the knowledge it contains, the understanding of what it was and what it meant and why it matters, that can be built and maintained in ways that honour the communities whose heritage it is. That process is underway. It is incomplete. It needs more resources, more institutional commitment, more genuine partnership between archaeologists and the communities they work alongside. But the thread is there. Burke's academic advocacy in the 1970s, Bellamy's community consultation in the 1990s, the partial repatriation of the 2000s. Each of these was a step toward a better relationship between the official story of Canadian history and the much older, much deeper story that the McDougall chamber represents. We are not at the end of that process, but we are further along than we were. Let's talk about what we know and what we do not know. It is worth being precise about this, because the story of the McDougall chamber has attracted enough imprecision over the years from both defenders and skeptics that clarity is valuable. What we know with confidence. A constructed underground chamber was found on a farm near Petrolia, Ontario, in 1897. The chamber had fitted stone walls, a deliberately prepared floor, and a double chamber configuration with a connecting passage. Artifacts recovered from the site included ceramics consistent with a late woodland date, copper pieces consistent with the Lake Superior trade tradition, a carved bone tool, and a fragment of textile. The chamber was documented by multiple investigators over several decades, with consistent descriptions of its basic architectural features. A GPR survey in the early 1990s confirmed that the chamber was still intact and revealed additional underground features, including a third void and possible evidence of artificial mound construction. What we believe with moderate confidence, based on cumulative evidence but without definitive dating, the chamber was built sometime between roughly 200 CE and 1400 CE, with the construction phase possibly being significantly earlier than the most recent occupation phase. The chamber was part of a tradition of underground ceremonial construction that was widespread across the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest region. Its use was likely ceremonial rather than purely practical. It was connected, through the trade materials found within it, to the broader networks of exchange and cultural exchange that linked communities across pre-colonial North America. What we do not know and cannot currently establish, the specific cultural affiliation of the chamber's builders, the precise date of construction, and the precise date of last use, the full extent of the constructed features beneath and around the hill, the specific ceremonies or practices associated with the space, whether the chamber is related to any specific oral tradition currently maintained by living communities, and if so, what that tradition says about its origins and purpose. What we suspect but cannot prove. The chamber may be significantly older than its most recent ceramic deposits suggest, potentially extending back into the Middle Woodland period or earlier. The hill over the chamber may be at least partially artificial, representing a mound construction associated with the chamber rather than a natural topographic feature. There may be additional constructed features in the surrounding landscape that have not been identified or investigated. The chamber is not unique, but is one of multiple similar features distributed across southwestern Ontario and the broader Great Lakes region. The gap between what we know and what we suspect is where the real story lives. It is the territory that proper investigation might close, at least partially. It is also the territory that attracts speculation, both responsible and irresponsible. The uncertainty is not an invitation to invent explanations. It is an invitation to investigate carefully, with proper methods, proper consultation, and proper commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads. That investigation has not happened yet, not fully, not in the way that would actually answer the questions the chamber raises, but the questions remain, and they are good questions. They are the kinds of questions that, if answered, would change the story we tell about this land, would give depth and dimension and genuine complexity to a national history that has been too shallow and too narrow for too long. Who built the room under the hill? How old was it, really? What were they doing down there in the darkness, with their copper and their fire and their carefully fitted stones? And what else did they build, in the hills and along the rivers, and beneath the surface of this ancient and layered landscape that we have not yet found? These are not fringe questions. They are the questions at the heart of understanding what this place was before it became what we now call Canada. Let's go north for a while, because one of the things that gets lost when we focus exclusively on the McDougall Chamber in southwestern Ontario is the sheer scale of pre-colonial human activity across the entire Canadian landscape. The chamber was not built in a void. It was built in a world that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the forests of the South to the Arctic, a world that was dense with human presence, human activity, and human meaning in ways that the official story of Canada consistently underestimates. In the boreal forest of northern Ontario and Quebec, a tradition of winter lodges partially sunk into the ground provided insulation against brutal cold. These semi-subterranean structures were used by Algonquian-speaking peoples across a vast swath of the Canadian Shield. Their construction was practical, but it also drew on the same understanding of the underground as a stable, meaningful space that animated the more elaborate ceremonial chambers of the Hopewell tradition. Archaeological work at James Bay lowland sites has documented these lodge forms going back several thousand years. Further north, in the eastern Arctic, the Dorset culture built structures with underground passages and partially subterranean rooms, serving both practical and ritual functions. The Thule people who followed them brought from Alaska a highly developed tradition of semi-subterranean architecture. The classic Thule winter house was built partially underground, with entrance passages that trapped cold air at the entrance while keeping the living area warm. Practical engineering of a high order, but also cosmological. The passage from above to below was a significant threshold in Inuit understanding of how space was organized. This is worth noting because it shows that the tradition of meaningful underground space was not limited to any particular cultural tradition or ecological zone. It appeared across the full breadth of what is now Canada, in forms adapted to radically different environments and cultural contexts, but sharing a fundamental logic. The Earth has depth. That depth is different from the surface. And the difference is not just physical. Coming back south to the Great Lakes region, there is one more tradition that deserves attention in the context of the McDougall Chamber, and that is the tradition of the Thunderbird medicine bundles and the ceremonial lodges associated with them among the Ojibwe and related Anishinaabe peoples. The Thunderbirds, in Anishinaabe tradition, are powerful spirit beings associated with storms, with the sky, and with the power of renewal. Their bundles, the sacred objects associated with their ceremonies, were some of the most closely guarded items in Anishinaabe ceremonial life. And the lodges where these bundles were kept, and where the ceremonies associated with them were conducted, were sometimes built at or below ground level, in spaces that were understood to be connected to the deep earth where the roots of the Thunderbird's power extended. The correspondence between the sky powers and the earth powers, the Thunderbirds above and the great serpents below, was one of the organizing principles of Anishinaabe cosmology, and the ceremonial spaces that enacted this correspondence were built to reflect it. A chamber that was below the surface, accessible through a narrow descending passage, associated with copper, which was itself linked in Anishinaabe tradition to the great underwater spirits, would have been precisely the kind of space where these powerful cosmological relationships were enacted. The McDougall chamber's configuration, the narrow entrance passage, the double chamber structure, the copper, the fire, all of it fits this template with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The specific cultural affiliation of the chamber's builders remains uncertain, but the tradition into which it fits, the tradition of underground ceremonial space associated with the deep powers of the earth and the materials that connected human beings to those powers, is real and well documented. It was practiced across the Great Lakes region for centuries. It left physical traces in the landscape that archaeologists are only beginning to map and understand. And it was connected to living traditions that still exist, that are still practiced in modified forms, in communities that have survived everything the colonial period has thrown at them. There is something extraordinary about that survival. The chamber was sealed, forgotten, and left in darkness for centuries. The tradition it was part of was suppressed, disrupted, nearly destroyed by the forces of colonization. But neither the chamber nor the tradition actually ended. The chamber waited in the earth. The tradition waited in the memories of elders who refused to let it die even when it was dangerous to keep it alive. And in 1897, a farmer's shovel broke through the ceiling of the chamber and the light came back in. Whatever metaphorical weight you want to put on that moment, it is genuinely moving to contemplate. Centuries of darkness, of stillness, of patience, and then a shaft of spring light falling onto those fitted stones for the first time in 500 years, or 1,000 years, or 2,000 years. The chamber had kept what it was given. It was waiting to be found. The question is whether we are ready to receive what it has to offer. Whether we can be as patient as the chamber has been, as willing to take the long view, to understand that the story of this land does not begin with European contact, and does not end with the establishment of the modern state. Whether we can hold the full depth of what has happened on this ground, and let that depth inform how we understand ourselves and the place we inhabit, that is what the room under the hill asks of us. Not certainty, not dramatic revelations, not ancient mysteries solved, just attention. Just the willingness to look carefully at what is there and to take it seriously, to give it the credit it is due, to hear what it has to say about the people who made it, and the land that held it, and the tradition that both expressed. It is a modest ask, but it is one that Canadian history has been resisting for a long time. Let's talk now about what a proper investigation of the McDougall site might look like, because this is not a purely academic question. It is a practical one, and it is worth thinking through carefully. The first step would be consultation. Before any new archaeological work was planned or funded, a genuine consultation process with the First Nations communities, whose traditional territory includes the Petrolia area, would be essential. Not a checkbox exercise, not a notification process, but a real conversation about what kind of investigation would be appropriate, what the community's interest in the site was, what traditional knowledge existed that might be relevant to the interpretation of the findings, and what any new investigation should ultimately serve. This consultation would likely involve the Amjivnang First Nation, whose traditional territory directly includes the Petrolia area, but also potentially the Walpole Island First Nation, the Caldwell First Nations, and other Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, whose traditional connections to southwestern Ontario are part of the relevant context. Each of these communities would bring different perspectives and different knowledge to the table. The second step would be a comprehensive, non-invasive survey. The GPR work that Bellamy conducted in the early 1990s was technically limited by the capabilities of that era. Modern GPR equipment is significantly more sensitive and can resolve features at greater depth and with more precision than was possible 30 years ago. A new survey, conducted with current technology and covering not just the immediate vicinity of the known chamber, but the broader hill and surrounding area, would be enormously informative. Additional methods could be deployed alongside GPR. Magnetometry surveys detect variations in magnetic field strength associated with burned areas, metal concentrations, and structural features. Ground-penetrating conductivity mapping can identify soil disturbances associated with construction or burial. LiDAR, airborne light detection and ranging, which has been transformative in the discovery of previously unrecognized earthworks across North America and Mesoamerica, could reveal landscape features around the site that are invisible from the ground. Together, these non-invasive methods could produce a comprehensive map of the subsurface features associated with the site before a single additional shovel was put into the ground. That map would then inform decisions about where and how any excavation should be conducted. The third step would be targeted excavation, focused on gathering dating information and recovering material for comprehensive analysis. The goal would be to sample the chamber carefully and precisely, taking small, well-documented samples for radiocarbon dating, paleobotanical analysis, ceramic petrography, and metallurgical analysis. With modern methods, even a small excavation could establish a reasonably precise construction date and characterize the copper artifact's connection to the Lake Superior trade network. The fourth step would be thorough publication and community engagement, making findings available to Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians alike. None of this is impossible. It requires will, resources, and genuine commitment. The question is whether they will be provided. There is one more thread in this story that we have not fully pulled on yet, and it concerns the specific artifact that, more than any other, captures the mystery of the McDougall chamber, the textile fragment. Whitmore described it. He was careful about it. He knew it was the most fragile and potentially the most significant thing he had found, and he documented it with more precision than he gave to most of the other objects. A fragment of woven material, roughly 4 inches by 3 inches, partially carbonized but retaining enough of its structure to show the pattern of the weave. In his description, he noted that the weave was not simple. It was not a basic over-under pattern. It was more complex, showing at least 2 different materials interwoven in a specific arrangement that he had not seen before in anything he knew from the regional archaeological record. He was not a textile specialist. He could not identify the fibers, though he speculated from their appearance that at least one of them might be vegetable rather than animal in origin. He could not identify the dyeing, if any had been applied. What he was certain of was that the fragment was not a modern intrusion, not something that had worked its way down from the surface in recent times. Its location in the sealed inner chamber, its association with the other artifacts, its partial carbonization consistent with ancient fire exposure, all argued for genuine antiquity. The textile fragment was the piece of evidence that most clearly pointed beyond pure function towards something ceremonial. Stone walls and copper pieces can be explained in purely practical terms if you are determined enough to explain them that way. A textile is different. You make a textile by hand, fiber by fiber, with a loom or the equivalent, investing hours of labor. The fact that a piece of textile had been placed in this underground space and left there, rather than being worn or used until it wore out, told you something about how the space was being used. In many North American indigenous traditions, textiles played specific roles in ceremonial contexts. They were used to wrap sacred objects. They were used as grave goods. They were used to line ceremonial spaces, to cover ceremonial items, to mark the transition between ordinary and sacred contexts. A textile in an underground ceremonial chamber was not there by accident. It had been placed there deliberately as part of whatever ritual complex was associated with the space. The specific weaving technology used to make it, if it could be determined, could potentially help identify the cultural tradition it came from. Different weaving traditions use different materials, different loom types, different pattern systems. The complex 2-material weave that Whitmore described if it could be analysed properly, might point toward a specific tradition with a known geographic and temporal distribution. This analysis was never conducted. The textile fragment was, as noted, treated with a preservative at some point after its recovery that complicated subsequent analysis. The mounting card on which it was placed made certain kinds of examination impossible without destroying the mounting itself. The artifact survived in the collection, but in a condition that made it less informative than it might have been. There is a lesson here that modern archaeologists have internalized, and that the investigators of the 1890s and early 1900s could not have fully understood. Every decision made about an artifact at the moment of its recovery shapes what can be learned from it later. A textile fragment, cleaned with the wrong solvent, mounted on acid paper, stored in fluctuating humidity and temperature, loses information at every step. Modern conservation practice, designed precisely to preserve the maximum amount of information in every artifact, is not excessive caution. It is the recognition that what you do not know yet might be exactly what a future researcher with better technology will be able to find. The textile fragment from the McDougall chamber carried information about the people who made it, the tradition they were part of, the materials available to them, the technology they used, the ceremony it was part of. Most of that information has been degraded or lost, but not all of it. The physical object still exists, and the field of ancient textile analysis has advanced dramatically in recent decades. Fiber identification techniques have become more sensitive. Pattern analysis has become more systematic. The comparative database of pre-contact textiles from North America has grown. It is possible, though not guaranteed, that a modern analysis of the fragment would yield significant new information, even in its compromised state. This is one of the concrete things that a new investigation of the McDougall collection could accomplish with relatively modest resources. The textile fragment is a metaphor, too, for the whole story, something made by hand, carefully and skillfully, encoding information about the people who made it. Something that survived against the odds, through mishandling and poor storage and institutional neglect. Something that has been waiting in the dark to be properly examined, properly understood, properly appreciated. Like the chamber itself. Now let's step back further in time, much further, to think about the deepest roots of the tradition we have been tracing. Because the tradition of underground ceremonial space in North America did not begin with the Hopewell period. It did not begin with the Poverty Point culture. It goes back further than that, to the very earliest archaeological evidence of human activity in the Great Lakes region, and it connects to something fundamental about how human beings everywhere have related to the Earth. The earliest people to inhabit what is now Ontario arrived sometime between 12,000 and 14,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum retreated northward. These Paleo-Indian people, as archaeologists call them, were following the big game animals that moved into the newly exposed landscape. They were highly mobile, traveling across vast territories in pursuit of caribou and other herd animals. They were not building underground chambers, but they were already relating to the Earth in particular ways. They left their most significant offerings in specific kinds of places, caches of high-quality stone tools buried at locations that appear to have been chosen for reasons other than simple storage convenience. Ochre deposits, the red mineral pigment that shows up in human ritual contexts going back hundreds of thousands of years in Africa and Eurasia, found at sites that suggest deliberate placement. The earliest evidence of something that might be called ceremony in the Ontario archaeological record is associated with specific landscape features: springs, cliff faces, prominent hills, places where the earth seemed to demand attention. The hill where McDougall found the chamber was not notable in any way that a modern person would immediately recognize. It was a low rise in fairly flat farmland, but it was at the intersection of two small watercourses, one of which fed into the system of creeks and rivers that ultimately connected to Lake Huron. It was elevated enough to offer a view across the surrounding land, and it was, as the Amjuvnang elder told Bellamy, a known place. A place with a name, a place with a story. Landscape features that become ceremonially significant do not do so randomly. They acquire significance over time, through repeated acts of attention, through the accumulation of visits and offerings and stories, through the recognition by one generation and the transmission to the next that this place is special. By the time the chamber was built, the hill had already been a place of significance for some period of time. The construction of the chamber was an act of intensification, of taking something that was already recognized as meaningful and making that meaning permanent by building it into the earth. This is what all of the great pre-colonial architecture of North America was doing. The Hopewell earthworks were built at confluences of rivers, at points where the landscape already had significance. The geometry encoded cosmological knowledge, mapping the relationship between human place and cosmic order. The McDougall chamber was working in the same register. It was saying, here, this hill, this intersection of water and earth, we make it permanent. We build it into the deep structure of the ground. We make a room where the ancient powers of the place can be encountered face to face, in the dark, with fire and copper and stone. That is a profound act. It is not primitive. It is not simple. It is the expression of a cosmological intelligence that understood something about the relationship between human beings and the land they inhabited. That modern Western culture, for all its technical sophistication, has largely lost. We build on the surface of things. We pave and cover and develop. Specifics. We treat the earth beneath our feet as substrate, as foundation, as obstacle. The people who built the McDougall chamber treated it as a partner, as something with depth and meaning and power that could be acknowledged and engaged and invited into the human ceremonial world. The room under the hill was an invitation, and in 1897, more than 5 centuries after the invitation was last accepted, John McDougall stumbled through the door. There is a larger question embedded in all of this that we should address directly, not just the question of what the McDougall chamber was, or how old it was, or who built it, but the question of why it matters. Why should anyone outside of a narrow circle of Ontario archaeologists and local history enthusiasts care about a room under a hill in Lambton County? The answer, I think, has to do with what it means to live in a place. Really, live in it. To have a relationship with the land that is deeper than ownership or use, that involves understanding what has happened there before you arrived, what the ground under your feet has held, what human life has looked like in this particular piece of the earth, across the full span of time that people have been present. Most Canadians do not have that relationship with the land they live on. They live on its surface, in structures that connect minimally to the geological and biological and historical reality beneath them. The story they are told about the place they live begins with European contact and ends with the present day. Everything before that first European arrival is either invisible or exotic, interesting perhaps as curiosity, but not as genuine heritage, not as part of the story of who they are and where they come from. The McDougall chamber challenges that. It says, this land was not empty. It was not a blank slate, waiting for European civilization to write its history on it. It was full of human life and human meaning and human construction that extended back far beyond the oldest date on any colonial document. The room under the hill is proof that the land has depth, not just geological depth, but human depth, and that depth belongs to all of us who live here now, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, in the sense that it is the real foundation of the place we call home. To ignore it, to leave it unexamined and unincorporated into the national story, is to live without a foundation. To build a sense of place on 2 centuries of colonial history, when there are 15 centuries of human history in the specific square mile where you stand, and quite possibly 30 centuries or 50 centuries, depending on how far back the evidence for human activity in that particular landscape goes. This matters for practical reasons too, not just philosophical ones. The decisions we make about land, about development, about heritage protection, about the rights of Indigenous communities to their ancestral territories, these decisions are made against a background understanding of what this land is and what it has been. If that background understanding is incomplete, if it excludes the vast majority of the human history of the place, then the decisions made against that background will be incomplete too. They will fail to account for things that matter. They will trade away heritage that cannot be replaced for short-term economic gains that, in the long run, do not compensate for the loss. The chamber under the hill near Petrolia is one piece of evidence, one room, but it points toward a complete revision of how we understand this land. A revision that archaeologists have been slowly working toward for decades, and that is beginning to reach a broader public through the work of historians, journalists, documentary filmmakers, podcast producers, and the countless people who are simply curious about what was here before the world they know came into existence. That curiosity is the most important thing. Not the specific facts about the chamber, though those facts are interesting. The curiosity itself, the willingness to ask, what was here before? To not be satisfied with a history that begins in the 16th century, when the land itself is billions of years old and the human presence on it is at minimum 12,000 years deep. That curiosity, followed honestly and rigorously, and with proper respect for the communities whose heritage is being explored, leads somewhere important. It leads toward a more complete picture, a more honest account, a more grounded sense of place. The room under the hill has been waiting to contribute to that picture for a very long time. It is still waiting. Now, let us think about what the person who built that room might have felt, standing in it for the last time before it was sealed. Because at some point, someone did stand there for the last time. Someone made the decision to close the chamber, to pack the entrance, to leave the copper and the fire ash, and the textile fragment and the carved bone in the darkness, for what they could not have known would be centuries. We do not know what circumstances led to that decision. It may have been a planned, ceremonial sealing, a deliberate act of consecration, the closing of a phase of use. Many Hopewell sites show evidence of deliberate closure, the ceremonial sealing of spaces that had been active and then were transitioned to a different kind of existence, present in the earth but no longer directly accessed. The act of sealing was part of the ritual cycle, not an ending but a transformation, or it may have been forced. A community that had to move quickly, carrying what they could, leaving behind what could not be carried. A disease that decimated the group. A conflict that displaced the population. The history of the Great Lakes region in the centuries before European contact was not peaceful. There were wars. There were episodes of population movement and displacement. The Iroquoian-speaking peoples, who would become the Wendat Confederacy, were in the process of expanding and consolidating their power across the region during the period when the McDougall Chamber was last in active use. Communities were absorbed, displaced, or destroyed. The people who sealed the chamber may have been sealing it because they expected to return. They may not have known it would be 5 centuries before anyone broke through the ceiling. They may have been thinking in terms of seasons, of a winter away and a spring return. They may have simply been careful people who understood that what was sacred needed to be protected, and who chose protection over access. Whatever the reason, whatever the circumstances, someone was last in that room. They saw it for the last time by firelight, the copper gleaming dully, the stone walls fitting perfectly together, the narrow passage to the inner chamber, a dark mouth in the far wall. They climbed out, they sealed the entrance, and they left. The hill grew over it, the seasons passed, languages changed above the ground, as they always do, populations shifted, the great networks of the Hopewell tradition faded, new confederacies formed and dissolved, the climate warmed and cooled and warmed again, European ships appeared on the horizon, the world above the ground was transformed beyond recognition. And below, in the stillness of the sealed chamber, the copper waited, the fire ash waited, the textile fragment, partially carbonized from the last fire that had burned in that space, waited. The fitted stones held their positions. The carefully prepared floor lay in darkness. And then, in the spring of 1897, a shovel broke through. There is something in that moment that refuses to be reduced to pure information. Something that insists on being felt as well as understood. Across whatever gap of time separated the last human being who stood in that space from John McDougall, something was preserved. Not just physical material, something harder to name. The fact of human presence. The fact of human care. The fact that someone, once, had thought it worth the effort to fit those stones together just so, to lay that floor, to place those objects in the inner chamber with deliberate intent. That effort did not vanish with the people who made it. It was there, in the stone, in the copper, in the shape of the space itself. It was still there in 1897, still legible to anyone who knew how to read it. And it is still there now, assuming the chamber has not been destroyed in the years since Bellamy's survey. Still legible, still waiting. Let's spend some time now with the specific geography of southwestern Ontario, because the landscape itself is a crucial part of this story, and it has been oddly absent from most accounts of the McDougall Chamber. Lambton County, where Petrolia sits, is part of a region shaped by the last glacial advance and retreat in ways that are still visible in the terrain. The land is flat to gently rolling, with a network of rivers and creeks draining into Lake Huron and Lake Erie. The soils are rich, which is why it became prime agricultural land. The subsurface geology is dominated by limestone and shale, with oil-bearing sands below that, which is why it became the centre of Canada's early petroleum industry. But before the oil, before the agriculture, before the colonial settlement, this landscape had a particular character that was shaped by its position at the junction of several major water route systems. The Thames River, which flows through the region before emptying into Lake St. Clair, was one of the major routes connecting the interior of what is now southwestern Ontario to the Great Lakes system. The Sydenham River, which flows through Lambton County itself and passes near Petrolia, was another, and Lake Huron, the great inland sea to the north and east, was the gateway to the broader Great Lakes network that connected this region to the entire upper Midwest. For people travelling on water, as virtually all long-distance travel in this region was conducted for most of human history, southwestern Ontario was a crossroads. You could move from the Ohio Valley northward, through Lake Erie, and into the Thames River system. You could move from Lake Huron eastward into Georgian Bay and the Ottawa River watershed. You could move westward through Lake Huron and the Straits of Mackinac into Lake Michigan and the Mississippi drainage. This was not a backwater. It was a hub. The trade goods that moved through this hub left traces at archaeological sites across the region. Copper from Lake Superior, found at sites near the Thames River. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, found at Hopewell-influenced sites in southwestern Ontario. Flint from Ohio, sources found at campsites along the Sydenham. The region was part of a continent-wide web of exchange, and the people who lived here were active participants in that web. Not isolated backwoods communities, but connected, engaged, informed about events and developments across enormous geographic distances. The hill near Petrolia, sitting in this landscape, would have been part of a world that knew itself. That had names and stories for all the major landscape features within travelling distance. That maintained relationships, through ceremony and exchange and kinship connections, with communities hundreds of miles away. The chamber under the hill was not built in ignorance of the wider world. It was built by people who were plugged in their own terms, to a network of information and influence that spanned the continent. Understanding this is important for understanding what the chamber's contents mean. The copper was not just locally available material. It was Lake Superior copper, the most symbolically charged material in the Great Lakes ceremonial complex. Obtaining it required either long-distance travel or participation in the exchange network that moved it from the north shore of Lake Superior southward and eastward across the Great Lakes region. Either way, having it meant being connected. It was, among other things, a mark of connection, of relationship, of participation in a community larger than the local band. The ceramics placed in the chamber were locally made, showing that the immediate community was the primary actor in the space. But the copper said something different. It said that this community was not isolated. It had relationships. It was part of something bigger than itself. That combination, local construction and action, but regional and long-distance connection reflected in the materials, is characteristic of the most significant ceremonial sites in the Great Lakes region. They were local expressions of a shared tradition, rooted in specific landscapes, but connected to a broader world. Now, let's think about the people, not in the abstract, but as human beings who were born and grew up and worked and died in this landscape. They loved their children, grieved their losses, argued and reconciled. Their experience of the landscape was more immediate and physical than most modern people can imagine. They knew where the ice was safe to cross in February, which patches of high ground dried first in spring, where the mast years happened. This intimacy produced a kind of embodied, relational knowledge that is very hard to acquire any other way. The person or people who chose the hill as the site for the chamber brought all of that knowledge to the decision. The hill's particular configuration, its position relative to the watercourses, its visibility from certain directions, its relationship to other landscape features that may no longer be visible to us, all of this was considered. The choice of site was not arbitrary. It was informed by the same kind of deep, accumulated, collectively maintained knowledge that governed every other significant decision these communities made. And then there was the construction itself, the gathering of suitable stones, not just any stones, but stones of the right size, shape, and structural integrity for the specific positions they would occupy in the walls. The preparation of the site, the digging, the leveling, the careful fitting, the creation of the inner chamber, and the passage connecting it to the outer space, the preparation of the floor. All of this took time, required skill, involved planning, and it involved, almost certainly, ceremony. Major construction projects in indigenous traditions across North America were not purely practical undertakings. They were embedded in ritual frameworks that sanctified the work, enlisted the cooperation of the relevant spiritual powers, and marked the transition of the space from undifferentiated earth to meaningful constructed place. The digging of the initial pit would have been preceded by prayer or offering. The placement of the first stone would have been a ceremonial act. The completion of the structure would have been celebrated in ways that brought the community together in acknowledgement of what had been made. We do not know the specific ceremonies that accompanied the construction of the McDougall chamber. We cannot know, but we know that they happened because we know that construction of significant spaces in these traditions did not happen without them. The chamber was not just dug and built, it was made. The difference between digging and making is the difference between practical work and meaningful work. The McDougall chamber was meaningful work. Every stone in its walls was placed with intention. Every aspect of its design reflected decisions made within a framework of meaning that we are still working to understand. When McDougall broke through the ceiling, he encountered the result of that meaningful work. He may not have fully registered what he was looking at, but the newspaper reporter who interviewed him, the school teacher who came with his notebook, the physician who spent 2 years documenting what he found, something in each of them recognized that this was not just a hole in the ground. This was made. This meant something. Their intuition was correct. The chamber meant something. It still does. Let us follow that meaning now, not backward in time but forward, into the questions that the chamber raises for us today. For people living in Canada in the 21st century, people who are grappling with the legacies of colonialism, with the truth and reconciliation process, with the ongoing question of what this country owes to the indigenous peoples whose land it was built on. What does a room under a hill in Lambton County have to say to us about any of that? Quite a lot, I think. The chamber is evidence, physical and irreplaceable, that this land was not empty before European contact. That is not a novel claim. Every serious historian and archaeologist already knows it, but evidence matters. Knowing something in the abstract and seeing it concretely in the form of fitted stone walls and copper pieces and a carefully prepared floor are not the same experience. The chamber makes the knowledge visceral, and what the chamber shows is not just occupation, it shows investment. The people who built it were not passing through. They were putting down roots, not in the agricultural sense of clearing fields and planting crops, but in the deeper sense of building a relationship with a specific piece of land that was intended to last. They were saying, we claim this place, not in the colonial sense of legal title, but in the sense of, we know this place, we have made ourselves part of it, we have built our understanding of the world into its structure. That claim was not extinguished by European contact. It was disrupted, suppressed, and pushed underground, literally in some cases, but not extinguished. The communities that maintained the traditions of which the chamber was an expression are still here. They are asserting their claims, in courts and in policy discussions, and in cultural revitalization programs, and in the patient, daily work of keeping language and ceremony and knowledge alive when so many forces have worked to destroy them. The chamber is part of their evidence. Not their only evidence, not their most important evidence, but part of it. Part of the physical record that says we were here, we built here, we made this land ours in the deepest sense of that word. We were here before you. We will be here after the story you are telling about this land has run its course. That is a powerful message, and it deserves to be heard. We have covered a great deal of ground in this exploration, but there are a few more threads worth pulling before we bring this story toward its conclusion. The first is the question of parallel discoveries, not just in Canada, but across the border in the United States, that add to the picture of pre-colonial underground construction in the Great Lakes region. In 1890, 7 years before the McDougall discovery, workers digging a drainage ditch near the town of Newark in Licking County, Ohio, almost due south of Lake Erie and the Ontario border, broke into an underground chamber that was immediately recognized as associated with the famous Newark earthworks, the largest set of Hopewell geometric earthworks ever built. The Newark earthworks cover an area of more than 4 square miles, incorporating circles, octagonals, and connecting avenues that were aligned to the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, with a precision that astonished the astronomers and surveyors who studied them in the 19th century. The chamber found in 1890 was not part of the main earthwork complex. It was a secondary feature, located about half a mile from the nearest major earthwork in a low hill that had not previously been identified as artificially constructed. But once the chamber was found, closer examination of the hill revealed that it had been modified, its natural shape augmented by the addition of soil to create a more pronounced mound form. The chamber itself was small, roughly 8 feet in diameter, with walls of dry-laid limestone and a floor of compacted clay. It contained no human remains. It contained a small cache of objects, several copper pieces, a collection of mica sheets cut into geometric shapes, and what appeared to be the remains of a wooden box or container, too decayed to be reconstructed, but identifiable from the pattern of wooden fibers preserved in the floor sediment. The mica is significant. Mica, the thin, translucent mineral that splits into flat sheets, was one of the most important trade items in the Hopewell Exchange network. It was mined in the southern Appalachian Mountains and traded northward and westward across enormous distances. Hopewell sites in Ohio contain mica in large quantities, cut into geometric shapes and silhouettes that are among the most distinctive artistic products of the Hopewell culture. Finding mica in a small secondary chamber near the Newark earthworks was, for the archaeologists who examined the site, not surprising. It confirmed the connection between the chamber and the broader Hopewell ceremonial complex. What is interesting in the context of the McDougall story is the architectural parallel. The Newark chamber and the Petrolia chamber were not identical. Different materials, different proportions, different geographic context, but both were small underground spaces with dry-laid stone walls, deliberately prepared floors, no human remains, and a cache of ritually significant objects. Both appeared to be secondary features associated with, but not part of, the main ceremonial infrastructure of their respective landscapes. This pattern, a small secondary underground chamber associated with a larger ceremonial complex, is actually documented at several Hopewell sites and related sites across the upper Midwest. It suggests that these small chambers served a specific and repeatable function within the broader ceremonial system. They were not simply random deposits or incidental features. They were a consistent element of the ceremonial landscape. What function? The absence of human remains distinguishes them from burial chambers. The presence of ritually significant objects, copper, mica, ceramics, in specific arrangements, rather than in the jumbled accumulation of a deposit, suggests purposeful placement rather than casual storage. And the double chamber configuration that characterizes at least some of these sites, including the McDougall chamber with its inner room accessible only through a narrow passage, points toward a spatial hierarchy, an outer space and an inner space, with the inner space being more restricted, more protected, more intensely charged. The architectural logic of inner and outer, the progressive restriction of access as you move toward the most sacred part of a space, is a nearly universal feature of ceremonial architecture across cultures. Churches have naves and sanctuaries. Hindu temples have outer courts and inner shrines. Kivas, the semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers of the ancestral Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest, have spatial hierarchies that control access to the most sacred elements of the space. The double chamber configuration of the McDougall site and the Newark chamber reflects the same logic applied to the specific architectural tradition of the Great Lakes region. In the innermost space was where the most significant materials were placed and the most significant acts were performed. The narrow passage between the two spaces was a threshold. Passing through it was an act of transition, of entering a different order of reality. This is what anthropologists call liminality. To build liminality into stone, to make the experience of threshold structurally enforced by the architecture, was an act of profound ceremonial intention. The people who built the McDougall chamber knew what they were doing. They understood the logic of space and threshold in ways that required not metal tools or writing, but time, tradition, and the accumulated wisdom of many generations who cared deeply about how space was made and what it meant. The McDougall chamber is one expression of that understanding. The Newark chamber is another. The Ohio Hopewell burial mounds, the Stratford chamber, the Manitoba Medicine Bundle lodges, all different, but all sharing a logic, a framework, a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and the earth. That shared logic is the real discovery. The understanding that this continent was full of people who were building, thinking, creating, relating to the earth and each other in sophisticated and meaningful ways. The room under the hill is a door into that North America, sealed for centuries, stumbled through by accident in 1897. The question that has been asking itself ever since is simple. Are we ready to walk through? There is a specific question that comes up whenever this story is told to a general audience, and it deserves a direct answer. The question is some version of, why haven't I heard about this before? If this chamber is real, and if it was found in 1897, and if it is genuinely significant evidence of pre-colonial sophistication in Ontario, why is it not in the history books? Why is it not taught in schools? Why is it not a landmark with a museum attached to it and a Wikipedia article that everyone knows? The answer is complicated and multifaceted, but it is not mysterious. It is the result of identifiable forces operating in identifiable ways over a century and more. The forces that kept it obscure are identifiable. Institutional inertia. The chamber did not fit the established consensus, so it was acknowledged, partially investigated, and filed away. Resource scarcity. Sustained investigation of ambiguous sites costs money that institutions rarely spend without clear returns. Political context. The official story of colonial Canada had no room for sophisticated pre-colonial architecture. The alternative history circus. When sensational claims attached themselves to the story in the 2000s, serious researchers pulled back to avoid being associated with pseudo-archaeology. And the simple passage of time. The artifacts are degraded, the site is on private land, the researchers who were closest to the story are gone. None of these forces were inevitable. Different decisions could have produced a different outcome. But here we are, and the question now is not what should have happened, but what should happen next. What should happen next is a matter on which reasonable people can disagree, and I want to be honest about the limits of what any single account of this story can prescribe. The decisions about how to proceed with a site like the McDougall Chamber involve multiple communities, multiple institutions, and multiple kinds of knowledge, and they should be made by the people most directly affected, not by commentators from the outside. But there are things that seem clearly right. Regardless of where the specific decisions land, the story should be told. It should be told accurately, with appropriate acknowledgement of uncertainty, with respect for the indigenous communities whose heritage it represents, and with a genuine effort to convey what it means, rather than just what it is. Not sensationalized, not instrumentalized in service of agendas it does not actually support, but told in full, with all its complexity and its significance. The physical site should be protected. Heritage designation of some kind, developed in consultation with the relevant First Nations communities, would prevent the site from being destroyed by development before a proper investigation can be conducted. This is a matter of basic cultural heritage management. The chamber has survived for centuries. It should survive long enough to be properly studied. A proper study should eventually happen, not as an imposition, not as a colonization of indigenous heritage by academic institutions, but as a partnership, with First Nations communities leading or co-leading the investigation, and with any findings being returned to and interpreted by those communities as their primary audience. The findings of that investigation, whatever they turn out to be, should be integrated into the way Canadian history is taught and told, not as an addendum, not as a curiosity, but as a central element of the story of this land. Because what the chamber represents, the depth and complexity and sophistication of pre-colonial human presence in Ontario, is not a supplement to Canadian history. It is Canadian history, the oldest and longest chapter of it. These are not radical proposals. They are the minimum that the evidence demands. A room under a hill in Lambton County has been waiting a long time for this minimum to be provided. The waiting should not continue indefinitely. What John McDougall found in the spring of 1897 was, ultimately, a reminder that the land under our feet has a story, and that story is far older than the one we usually tell. A reminder that human beings have been making meaning in this place for a very long time, in ways that deserve to be recognized and understood. A reminder that what we call Canada is built on top of something ancient, and that understanding what that something was is not just an academic exercise, but a moral and practical necessity for anyone who wants to live honestly and responsibly in this place. The room is there. It has been there for centuries. It will continue to be there until someone, finally, makes the decision to find out everything it can tell us. That day has not come yet, but it is closer than it has ever been. And in the meantime, the chamber waits, in the quiet dark beneath the hill, in a field in southwestern Ontario, with its fitted stones and its copper, and the ghost of the fire that burned there the last time a human hand held a torch in that space, centuries ago, patient, complete, holding its secrets and its stories and its silence, until we are finally ready to hear. Let's take this story somewhere slightly different now, somewhere that broadens the scope one final time before we bring it home. Because the McDougall Chamber, as significant as it is in its own right, is also a lens through which we can look at a much larger and more troubling question. The question of how much of North America's pre-colonial past has simply vanished, not through the ordinary operations of time and entropy, but through the specific and documented destruction of heritage that accompanied European colonization. What happened to the material heritage of pre-colonial North America in the 2 centuries following European settlement was not accidental, it was systematic. The great earthwork complexes of the Ohio Valley were ploughed under. The Newark earthworks originally covered 4 square miles. Today, a golf course occupies one of its most important sections. In Canada, Iroquoian village sites were ploughed under as agricultural settlement proceeded. The ceremonial sites of the prairies were destroyed by a wheat economy that moved across a landscape managed for human habitation for thousands of years. The loss is incalculable. We will never know what was destroyed before it could be documented. The McDougall Chamber survived partly by luck, sitting in a hill that nobody needed to dig into before MacDougall, preserving its interior in remarkable condition because the hill itself protected it from the physical processes that had destroyed so many above-ground features. The chamber is a survivor of a process of destruction that claimed most of what surrounded it. When we marvel at what the chamber shows us about pre-colonial Ontario, we should also hold in mind what it does not show us, because it cannot, because those things are gone. The village or camp that was its home community, the other ceremonial features that were associated with it, the landscape of meaning within which it made sense, the hills and watercourses and gathering places and travel routes that gave the space of southwestern Ontario its human character for the people who lived in it. Most of that is gone, paved over, ploughed under, built upon. What we have are fragments, and the chamber is one of the most significant of those fragments precisely because it survived. This is why heritage protection matters so concretely, not as an abstract good, but as a practical necessity for the recovery of a story that has already been so badly damaged. Every site that is lost is evidence that cannot be recovered. Every chamber that is sealed beneath a water main without proper investigation is a question that cannot be answered. Every mound that is ploughed under, every midden that is excavated without documentation, every artifact that is dug up by amateurs and sold without scientific context, represents a permanent diminishment of our capacity to understand what was here before. The chamber under the hill near Petrolia is one of the very few sites of its kind that has survived with its structural integrity intact. That survival, accidental as it was, imposes an obligation to treat what has survived with the care and seriousness that everything lost deserved and did not receive. There are people working to honour that obligation, archaeologists who specialise in the pre-contact period of the Great Lakes region, heritage professionals in provincial and federal agencies, First Nations community members engaged in cultural revitalisation and heritage protection, researchers in universities and museums, local historians in communities across southwestern Ontario who care about the deep history of the places where they live. All of these people, in their various ways, are working against the tide of loss, working to document what survives, to protect what can be protected, to recover what can be recovered. The work is slow. The resources are always insufficient. The bureaucratic and political obstacles are real and persistent, but the work is being done, and occasionally something happens to accelerate it. A discovery, unexpected and dramatic, that cuts through the usual institutional sluggishness and makes the urgency of the work visible to a broader audience. A story that captures something essential about what is at stake, that makes people feel, not just understand, the significance of what we stand to lose and what we still have the chance to preserve. The MacDougall Chamber is one of those stories. It has been waiting to be that story for more than a century. The original newspaper account, in 1897, came close to telling it, but without the context that makes it fully comprehensible. Whitmore's report came closer, but it was filed in an archive where almost nobody could find it. Burke's article came closer still, but it reached only a specialist audience. Bellamy's thesis and the partial repatriation and the Stratford rapid assessment and Colin Fenwick's online synthesis, each of these came closer to the full telling. This telling, whatever its limitations and gaps, is an attempt to go further, to put the chamber in its full context, to connect it to the broader tradition of underground ceremonial architecture in pre-colonial North America, to honour the Indigenous communities whose heritage it represents, to ask honestly what has been lost and what can still be recovered, to make a case for why it matters. The room under the hill is not just a room, it is a door, and doors are for walking through. The question is not whether we are capable of walking through it. The question is whether we have the will, whether we can make the investments of attention and resources and genuine partnership that the story demands, whether we can expand our understanding of what Canadian history is and where it begins. The evidence says we can. The history says we have not. The future is undetermined. But the chamber is still there. in a hill in Lambton County, in the dark, waiting. And it has been waiting a very long time. Long enough to know that some things worth waiting for do eventually come to pass. There is something strange and moving about the fact that we know the chamber is still there. Not excavated, not investigated, just there, in the earth, sealed and waiting, beneath a field in southwestern Ontario. It has been there through 2 world wars, through the Great Depression, through every upheaval of the last century. The chamber sat in its hill, unaware of the turbulent surface world above it. The stone walls are still standing. The floor is still laid. The second chamber is still connected to the first by its narrow passage. The space is still there, still shaped, still architectural rather than merely geological. That persistence is itself a kind of testimony, not to anything supernatural, not to any power beyond the ordinary but extraordinary skill of the people who place those stones. A testimony to workmanship, to the fact that when human beings make something with care and precision, it endures, long beyond the lives of the makers, long beyond the memory of those who knew them, into a future that the makers could not have imagined, but that the work itself has entered without diminishment. The people who built the chamber are gone. Their names are not recorded. Their specific faces cannot be reconstructed even from the most sophisticated forensic tools available to us. But what they made is here, and what they made tells us something about them that no name or face could tell with equal clarity. It tells us that they were careful, that they understood how materials worked and how to make them work together, that they thought about the future, not just about the immediate moment, that they cared about what they were making and why. These are not small things to know about people who lived centuries ago in a place that official history has largely treated as empty. They are profound things. They are the foundation of recognition, of seeing another group of human beings as human beings, fully and without reservation. The chamber is, in the end, a place where recognition happened, where human beings recognized the significance of a specific location and chose to mark that recognition in stone and copper and fire, where the decision was made to build something that would last, and where, whether they knew it consciously or not, they left a message for anyone who would come later and dig into the hill and find what they had made. The message is simple. We were here. We were fully human. We understood things worth understanding, and we made something that could carry that understanding forward into a future we would not live to see. We found the message. It took more than a century, and the reception was far more complicated and confused than the message itself. But we found it. Now the question is what we do with it. Whatever we do, we should do it with the chamber in mind. That specific room, in that specific hill, in that specific field in Lambton County, Ontario. The fitted stones, the narrow passage, the inner chamber, the copper and the fire ash and the textile fragment that is now in institutional storage, partially degraded but still there. The people who built it deserve to have their story told completely and honestly, and with the respect it merits. The communities who are their descendants deserve to have their heritage recognized and returned to them as fully as it can be, not just as artifacts in storage, but as knowledge, as narrative, as part of the living story of who they are and where they come from. And the land, the actual physical land of southwestern Ontario, the fields and rivers, and the low hills that cross the landscape, the land deserves to be understood as what it is, not empty, not a blank slate, not a wilderness waiting for civilization, but a landscape already full of human meaning when the first European ship appeared on the horizon, full of story, full of construction, full of the accumulated weight of centuries of human life, lived in close and knowing relationship with everything the land offered. The room under the hill is a door into that full and complex reality. It has been waiting for a long time to be properly opened. The waiting should not continue much longer.